Well, I don't have much money, and I don't have much time, and I don't have many friends I could call mine. And I've been deceived, yeah, but haven't we all? I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall. Well, I don't know why, and I don't know where, and I don't even know how, and I no longer care. But I've seen your face, and I've heard your call. Yes, I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall. Let it go.
Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A. I'm your host for today, Peter Dixon. I often laugh when I say that because I'm pretty much the only host, although we have had three different hosts in the past, in the early days in season one on the podcast platform. My special guest today is Brendan Valiant. How are you, Brendan?
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Mate, so good to have you on the program. We had such a great exchange in emails this morning, or Messenger, or whatever it was. And I think I said to you just before we went live, I think, we'd enjoy hanging out, having a hot drink together at a cafe by the ocean sometime.
Definitely.
And we recognise that even though we have quite polar opposite views in some areas, you had a great little analogy. Can you say that again?
Well, if you're going east and I'm going west, eventually we'll meet up.
Yeah. So there's common ground, and I think one of the things I love about the community that grows within SDAQ&A is that we're willing to be friends in spite of our diverse and divergent views. So you're on the program to kind of do a little bit of a rebuttal to the recent Lunar Sabbath interviews I did with Steve Scott and Kerry Wynn. And I love that because I love hearing people's opposing views and talking about them. I'm learning a lot about this stuff. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to share a little bit about your Adventist background and what you're doing now and why you're here. We've kind of touched on that a little bit, but unpack that a bit more. But we've got here Brendan Paul Valiant, non-denominational pastor, Adventist in exile. We'll come to that a little bit later. And at the start, I just want to say to those watching regarding the moon and the lunar cycle, or the cycle of the moon, the earth, the stars, the sun, I think we're all in agreement that that's a really accurate clock. You can really use that mechanism to predict very accurately repetitive time frames. And so what I guess we're potentially chatting about is disagreements over what people hang on those time frames and those special events. Last night, I think it was a super full blue moon. And it's interesting, if I'm right, what's the date today? Yeah, there was 2 full moons this month, one on the 1st of August and one last night, on the last night of August. So, anyway, I just wanted to say that because I think everybody can agree that the stars, sun, moon, earth rotations are a reliable and accurate measurement tool, and you'd agree with that too.
Totally.
So tell us what we're going to talk about today. But before that, tell us a little bit about you and your involvement with Adventism.
So I was not raised a Christian at all. I was raised in a typical Aussie home where sports was the church, and barbecue was the altar, and beer was the communion drink. So that was what I was raised in. But funny enough, my parents wanted me to get a Christian education. And so I went to, well, not a Christian, sorry, a private education, and that happened to be Christian schools. So I was sent, first of all, to an open brethren school. I was actually bullied there all through primary school. Then we moved to a Seventh-day Adventist school, because if you go back far enough in my family, I became what I would consider a first generation, but also a fourth generation Adventist, because my great grandfather had been an Adventist up in Atherton Tablelands.
Wow.
He was that's why my dad, when he saw that there was an Adventist school, he's like, oh, I've got that memory there
Of his father.
of his grandfather.
Of his grandfather. Wow.
Yeah. So my great grandfather had been an Adventist elder up there, and also a Freemason. Funny enough.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
I've got on my mother's side, grandfather and great grandfather Adventists, and one was a Mason as well.
Mm.
And,
yeah. Well, I mean,
and came from up that way.
Okay.
Well, yeah, we might be related.
We might be related.
Except your great grandfather would be the generation of my great great grandfather, which is the man I'm talking about, my great great. So there we go.
Okay. Fantastic.
Sorry, we're sidetracking. Back to the moon.
Yeah, look, so I became an Adventist simply because I liked a girl, and so I started going to church to see her outside of school. And when I was going to church, I fell in love with God through prophecy. I was going to an Adventist school, but I was researching every other religion. I was very keen on the New Age at the time that I started to get into prophecy, and I'm like, oh, okay. So prophecy is something that really indicates that there's a person who knew it before it happened. Okay, I need to explore this. And so through that, I became a Christian. I've had ups and downs within the Adventist church. Because I come from outside, I don't take things for granted, as a lot of people I see who are raised within the church. And so I ask questions, I ask them openly. That doesn't make you a lot of friends, as you're probably
I'm discovering that too.
And also because of the nepotism within the church, I didn't find myself to have a natural click. And so I've floundered in that area of, not being truly accepted based on not being, having a generational, 4 generations removed is not really, doesn't give me a last name. Well, my last name, Knudsen, originally, we changed our name after I got married. That's another story. But I found myself because of these questions, to have this kind of up and down relationship with the hierarchy more so than anything else. The grassroots I'm pretty fine with, but the hierarchy doesn't tend to like challenge, doesn't like questions.
I've definitely had a similar trajectory.
Yeah, so unlike you, who removed your membership, as I understand it, mine was stripped of me only in 2022. Yeah, last year. So last year.
Right. Can you unpack that a little bit, or will we stick to the Lunar?
We'll stick to this topic maybe another time. It was I took a very I took a very pro freedom stance during the craziness that we've had over the last few years.
Mm.
I'm a Christian counselor by background, and I saw what damage the lockdowns and mandates were doing to everyday people. And I was upset that our church wasn't taking, at the very least, a neutral stand,
Right.
and was coming down on the side of oppression more often than not. And that put me, we had just undergone a change from one pastor to another, and the new pastor we had was here on a visa from overseas. And so when the government said jump, for whatever reason, he said how high. And I, of course, was like, okay, well, no, this is not in principle with Christian freedom. And we ended up on different sides of things.
Right. Right. And I guess that's how you had similar interactions with the church hierarchy, with this notion that we've both just agreed upon, that there seems to be this desire for you not to ask questions. A lot of people have asked, think, or suggested, or asked me, "Am I trying to attack the Adventist hierarchy in the church?" I'm not actually. I just have.
Mm,
I'm just born with an inquisitive mind and love asking questions to
yes.
learn and to challenge as well.
Mm,
And I was sitting there last night and I pondered, and a couple of sentences just kept going over in my mind. I don't know if I'm coming up with an original quote, but it's certainly, uh, I'm sure it's not. But I've just written them down. When people don't want you to ask questions, that's a good reason to keep on asking them.
yeah.
And I think two things that people, um, who movements or corporations or denominations, not only should they be okay with people scrutinizing their truth claims, they should welcome it and encourage it.
I totally agree. Um, I'm I'm a believer in transparency to a fault, I guess.
Yeah,
And so I, at the same time as a counselor, I know how to be
of
confidential when
course. Yeah.
it needs to be. But when it comes to public entities, whether it's the government, whether it's the church, I'm very much in favor of a transparent and open stream
Mm,
of access. And so, I like that there are entities like Spectrum and Adventist Today, for example. I
mm.
also like that there's Fulcrum 7 on the other side.
Yeah,
I
me
think
too.
that these entities are. I know people who will be like, "Oh, I'm okay with Spectrum and Adventist Today," but I think that's evil. The work that Fulcrum is doing. I'm like, okay, well, what's so wrong with it? You
Yeah.
know,
And
it's asking questions that should be asked. I mean, within the Adventist Church, there should be transparency on for example, the division wage scale.
yeah.
People should know how much their pastors are getting paid. They're the most highly paid pastors of any denomination in Australia, and in terms of Adventist pastors, Australian pastors are the most highly paid in the world.
Yeah. Incredible.
Yeah.
And I agree that kind of transparency, as I said earlier, should be welcomed and encouraged.
Hmm.
Um, and I think you and I have a similar view on this too, just because we're challenging these um, institutions or those who are perhaps suppressing the notion of being able to ask questions. Sometimes I'm not even talking about the content. I'm talking
Hmm.
about the mechanism.
Yeah.
I know recently we've done some re-releases of Des Ford Glacier View.
Hmm.
My and someone wrote back to me that's in an official kind of capacity and said something like, "Oh, you guys seem to be obsessed with this." No, I could have a conversation about Glacier View and Des Ford and not even talk about the doctrinal theological side of it. I My interest is that if there is error, it needs to be reported accurately and
Yeah.
honestly. I don't care what the content is.
Yeah. It's how you do it versus what you're doing. And I think there are many, many travesties in the way that the church has handled not just the Des Ford Glacier View, but many issues that have arisen within our, and I mean, I'm talking Adventist, but all churches, all institutions, if they become institutional focused. I mean, I was dismembered in a church that has, tolerance of adultery within its ranks, and like never ever addresses it. And my the excuse for my dismemberment was because I said a few public statements online about the leadership and in a critical way, and I apologized for that in letters before the dismemberment and on the night of the dismemberment. So I mean, that's another topic. I don't have my ministry is not focused on the Adventist Church that much anymore. What happened was amazing. When I started, when they pulled the trigger on recommending me for dismemberment at a board meeting, two things happened simultaneously. I moved to Queensland. We moved house from New South Wales. Our lease was up to Queensland because I live in the border community, which is why it was actually more pressing for us. We had the border issues. Yeah. And then the next week that the day that the border hard closed in Queensland and New South Wales was the day that I did the last bond cleaning. So I just made it within hours across the border. I even had to put the keys in a letterbox because I couldn't get the keys to the New South Wales rental agency because of the border closure in those early times. And so they had pulled the trigger to say, we want to dismember this guy. I like dismemberment versus disfellowship.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
It's a better word. And so at that time, I'm stuck on this side, and I can't even attend my own funeral in the church. So for 7 months, the border was closed, and I couldn't attend. They couldn't hold a meeting because I couldn't attend. In that 7 months, we planted a church right on the border in a park where both states can meet. There's this. I don't know if you're familiar with the Coolangatta Tweed area.
Yeah.
Twin Towns.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
So just behind Twin Towns, there's a park that's on a peninsula where if you go up Boundary Road toward Point Danger, you're in Queensland. If you come down that same road, you're in New South Wales. And so they had no logistical way to monitor that part of the border.
Wow.
So they just said, this is no man's land, basically. They didn't say that. They just, that was in action what it was. So we started meeting in the park where you didn't have to do check-ins because you're just having a picnic as your group of people happening to have a picnic near each other. You're not having to wear masks because it's outdoors. There's no limits on congregational singing because you're not having a proper church. All of these things didn't apply. And so we just had a fun time out there. And that became a church plant. We offered to come under the conference. They said no. We offered to send part of our tithe towards them in line with the GC working policy and the SPD working policy. They said no. The first time I've ever heard the church refuse money. They refused to take some tithe. So we are a non-denominational plant now. And I work with pastors of, from Catholics to Pentecostals and everywhere in between. I'm actually on the steering committee for the Tweed Shire fraternal, right. And we are focused on community outreach and interfaith projects.
Wow. Do you have a name for the non-denominational gathering?
We just call ourselves Border Church. So it started. We actually, when the border first closed, I said, well, all these people from Queensland are going to be cut off from the church that we were attending. So I said, let's gather together in home churches. And so we started doing that, and we outgrew homes. So there was 1 week in New South Wales where unvaccinated were not allowed to go to churches. Churches were allowed to be open, but not allowed to have unvaccinated. It was just 1 week. And it was the stupidest thing. And that week, most Adventist churches closed. Most churches in general closed, Sunday churches as well, because they didn't want to make a choice. We looked at the loophole and said, well, hey, there's nothing to stop us from having an outdoor gathering in the park. And if other people happen to have an outdoor gathering near us, then so be it. And so we did that, and we ended up with 36 people that first week. And that's when we transitioned from home church. And it was a joke. I just said, let's have Border Church. And Border Church just stuck as a name.
As a name, yeah.
So we are Border Church.
I like it. Hey, well, thank you for that background, and we can do a whole interview about that topic. I'd love to do that. In fact, talking to you today before the program, I think I've come up with at least 5 topics that you and I can do 5 separate
I'm
programs.
welcoming of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love that. So, yeah, let's get back to the dark side of the moon. Thank you for watching, everyone. We've got a really good audience, good size audience. You watched Kerry Wynn's interview and possibly Steve Scott's as well. Tell us about your thoughts as you were watching these, and tell us what claims do you think they're making that you agree and disagree with.
I watched Kerry's. I didn't get a chance to watch much of Scott's because I didn't know how far back to go for that one. But with Kerry's, I'm familiar with Kerry. I engaged in some online back and forth when he first put out his Lying for God, uh, his Lying for God book years and years ago. And he's had like probably a dozen or more different versions of that book. I've been quoted by wrong names in it. He calls me, in one instance he calls me Brian Knudsen, and in another instance he calls me Brendan misspelled Knudsen. That's whatever. But he I like that he's always updating, trying to better his material. What I found that I could agree on, just from the offset, from the outset, I like to start with areas that I can agree on. He brought up some points which I think that I can resonate with, and I think that it highlights an area where Adventists have tended towards an extreme view. Since we've been meeting as Border Church, as a non-denominational, I tell the people who came along with me from the Adventist church, I say, let's not say things like Happy Sabbath on a Saturday, because we meet on Saturday. I say, let's not do that, because it assumes where someone else is coming from. What we do is we intend to model Sabbath in a way that people go away going, I want to do that every week. Without the, now, one-on-one you can do it, but from the front, we don't say Happy Sabbath sort of stuff, We let people be free, and we get a lot of people who double dip. They like to get a double dose of the Holy Ghost. They'll come on a Saturday to us, and then they'll go to another church on a Sunday. In fact, I go to a church most Sundays, a different church each week. That's how I've networked with the other pastors in the region. And I recommend doing that. If there's a church every day of the week, I'd be going to it to, network and engage. But with the what I believe is important with regards to Sabbath, the Bible in the 4th commandment doesn't call it an exclusive day of worship. And Adventists treat the Sabbath as the day of worship. And for me, it's a day of rest. Ironically, it's also my busiest day. We'll get into that in a moment, because that's an issue that Kerry did bring up. This idea of what happens when you have to work on the Sabbath, or if you had to work on the Sabbath. So, but it's a restful day. I'm an extreme extrovert, so I am in the company of people on Sabbath, and I'm like, oh, this is fully restful for me. I can understand how for introverts it might not be as restful, especially in the same sort of position. And a lot of pastors are actually introverts, I've noticed, in the Adventist church. So Sabbath is not an exclusive day of worship. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. That's every day ending in Y. So every day is a worship day. And I've had people say, oh, no, you can't worship. Where does it say that? Where does it say you can't worship on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday? Don't you go to prayer meetings on different days of the week? Like a lot of churches have a prayer meeting on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. That's worship, last I checked, the definition of worship. So we should be, if you're worshiping one day a week, you've got a problem. If you're worshiping one day a week, we should be worshiping every day. The Sabbath is a day, it's a special day, and that's okay for there to be special days, but it's not an exclusive day. And I find that to be something that I have come to understand. There was a pastor recently, we just had a baby. We've just had 6 weeks. Thank you. She's 6 weeks old tomorrow, tonight actually. And thankfully she's sleeping through the night now, 6 hours and 8 hours stretches. But she, when she was getting, due to be born, I scheduled a whole bunch of people to preach for us. And most of those were not from an Adventist background, because I can't, most Adventists in this region won't talk to me. But I had a Church of Christ minister, evangelist, preach for us one week, and he basically took a sermon that was essentially the practicalities of Sabbath, of Shabbat. It was about rest and finding rest in God. And he tells me that he goes to church on Sunday, but he treats Saturday as his Shabbat with his family. It's a family day, and a lot of pastors I'm discovering are doing that, who are Sunday pastors. So I think we've had a very narrow view, and I'm saying we as, from the Adventist perspective of Sabbath. So I like that there's questions being raised, and Kerry did bring up some points that I thought were essential on that. So when it comes to Sabbath, I do believe that we've got to reimagine and rediscover what that actually is, rather than just a legal code.
How have you wrestled with the notion of Ellen White having a vision where she sees a kind of big golden circle around the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment, and that it is a salvation issue? So you can expand keeping the Sabbath into every day, but can a Seventh-day Adventist consider the Sabbath as just a rest day and not a day that needs to be kept for salvational issue reasons?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't do a lot of Ellen White reading these days. She herself said, "Go to the Bible, and when you mastered the Bible, then then come to me." That's basically what she said, and she said you wouldn't need me if you read the Bible as you should. On that said, I do believe, like, I haven't found anything that she has said that if I was to adopt the principles of my Bible study, can't harmonize what she's saying. I just don't focus on her. But it's given that I'm not going to dodge it completely. I will say that I think that if you take the balance of everything she said, her whole idea was that the Sabbath would become a test when it was challenged by the worldly government. It's not a test now. So in this time, it's not something to be pushing. The more we push something, the more people push back. Whereas if we model something, then people are going to go, "Oh, that guy's non-threatening. That guy's not an issue." I find that there's a lot more we can have in common with these other people, and if they'll come, if I go to church with them, they often say, "Oh, I'm coming to yours next," and that gives them an opportunity to taste and see. The Bible, I just did a Bible study on this. God is so transparent. He's like, taste and see. That's his principle. Come, let us reason together. And it's in that relationship, in that engagement, that truth comes out, that things are brought to the light. I do think that the Sabbath commandment is a beautiful commandment. I don't think that it's abrogated in any way. I just think that it's not understood. We often read the fourth commandment: remember the Sabbath day and keep it. That's the way a lot of people read it.
Yeah.
And it's really keep it holy. Keep it as a day dedicated to me. And there's different ways you can do that. In my most conservative fundamentalist phase, there's no way that I would ever even consider spending money on the Sabbath. And I try not to now. I do everything I can not to. But we had where we meet is in a hall, a Country Women's Association hall, and it's down the road from a 7-Eleven. At the beginning of the year, there was an old lady in her 80s, had a coughing fit. And I asked around, I said, has anyone got any soothers? No one had any lozenges or anything. So I just went to the 7-Eleven, grabbed some, and brought it back. There was a family down your way in Currumbong who was going through a terribly tough time, and one of our elders from Border Church was down there visiting his daughter, and it was on a weekend, and I heard that this family was doing it really tough, and I contacted him and I said, "Look, I know it's too late to go before Sabbath because Sabbath's already happened, but is there any way you can get to a Toll's tomorrow and just buy a bunch of," like I said, "this is the stuff to buy. I'll reimburse you from the church funds," and make up a hamper and take it. And he did. because this was, it's good to do good. But the best sermon I've ever heard about Sabbath keeping is by my mentor, David Asherick. He was the pastor before the one that came and dismembered me. And David preached a sermon on Matthew chapter 11. And the point that he made is that the Sabbath commandment is to rest and extend rest. It's not just for you. It's for your cattle. It's for the alien within your gates. It's for the Gentile within your gates. Extend rest. So I said, when you go to Coles to buy this stuff, can you just use a self-checkout? Because you're not making anyone work then. You're just going in, getting the stuff and going. And so there's ways that we can be practical about it. Should you go as a habit? Probably not. There's a preparation day for a reason. But if there's something that's outside of your ability to prepare for, God's principle, Jesus outlined, is that it's good to do good on the Sabbath. The things you might traditionally see as being, work, if it's to do good, that's why, I have no problem with nurses, doctors. Hell, I was even in the Navy. As in my early Adventist walk, I joined the Royal Australian Navy. And I believe that even naval service and military service is something that's doing good in the most cases, and so these are things that in the Bible, people were working in the military on the Sabbath. These are things that were okay because they were considered to be part of the doing good.
Particularly regarding the Navy one, if God is on that Navy's side.
Well, I mean,
this kind of now brings us to the rubber hitting the road with the lunar and the seventh day keeping. If we're suggesting we have to keep the Sabbath day and guard its fringes with not buying things unless it's for good cause, we need to then define when that Sabbath is.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple of things, and this is where we'll get into talking about your rebuttal to Kerry.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say though that if you worked out what the Sabbath was using the very reliable mechanical clock that's in the heavens, the moon, the sun, the earth, and stars too to some degree, wouldn't you say that would be God giving us a really good clock to make sure we did keep the right day?
Yeah.
Better than just trying to guess when maybe the 7-day cycle is, particularly when you come into questions of, oh, look, I know that the calendar has been changed at least several times over the last 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And with the international date line, and where do you start the shadow of the sunset? Where's the official first day? Wouldn't you say that the lunar one could potentially be more accurate than the one where we're kind of just relying on maybe the Jews kept it ever since Adam to now?
Okay, you've brought a whole bunch of things into that, so we can tackle them one at a time.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the clock of the heavens. That's found in Genesis 1:14, where it says the sun, moon, and stars were for signs and seasons and days and years, and so that's on the fourth day of creation. I agree with that. The sun, moon, and stars are for the time, times and seasons and all of that, days and years. I do think though that the Sabbath is still according to that. You've got to count 7 sunsets, 6 sunsets and then Sabbath, and then 6 more sunsets, and then so it's still based on the sun at least. I think that there's a potential that it could be like, so you're asking a question, could it be more reliable? Yes, if there weren't things that were correctors along the way. So the question is, how do we know that the 7th day that we have today, like Saturday, how do we know Saturday or Friday night sunset to Saturday night sunset? How do we know that correlates to the creation Sabbath is the question.
And excluding the international dateline stuff. We'll keep it to
forget
that nice, simple thing. And how about we just imagine you and I are in Israel right now.
Yeah.
And Sabbath is a couple of days away, Saturday. Let's just look at the time of Christ to now. How reliable is that Saturday being continuously kept as a 7-day cycle since the time of Christ to now? Okay,
so I was actually going to say that we have 2 correctors up until the time of Christ. One was 40 years of manna. God is, if they were wrong before the 40 years of manna, they weren't wrong during that 40 years. God was telling which which day was the Sabbath, by there not being any bread fallen
Okay.
from heaven. Then you've got the second corrector, which is Jesus. And Jesus, if he's God, which I believe he is, would know which day is the Sabbath. And he says nothing about the timing at that point. Now, there is basically unbroken history from Jesus till today. There is unbroken chronology till today of not just, you can count from 7. There are synchronisms. There are certain things we can synchronize with the time of Jesus and with biblical time, and even with extra biblical time. So we know when Sabbaths were based on things like the Elephantine papyri. Have you heard of that?
Oh,
So Elephantine is an island in the Nile in the southern Egypt, and back in the early 1900s or the late 1800s, there was a bunch of papyri and ostraca that were discovered at Elephantine, and they were from this Jewish community that double dated some of their papyri with both Jewish dates and Egyptian dates, and we can synchronize those calendars and get a bit of evidence of that. Sabbath as a unbroken chain is reliable. So Saturday being the Sabbath, the day part of it anyway, is an unbroken chain. It's attested by multiple communities that dispersed outward from Israel, all agreeing with each other, forgetting date lines, but just agreeing with each other, whether they're in Babylon, Ethiopia, or or Russia. They all kept the same day as the
the
Sabbath.
sun went round.
Yeah, as when the sun went round. They didn't stop figuring out how to count to 7.
What
you
did
can,
they?
you
What
can
did
lose
they?
3 fingers and still count to 7.
Yeah. So what did they do? And that's a good analogy. What did they do, in 1582 when the Gregorian calendar came into play? How did they keep that 7-day cycle? How do we know that there wasn't a couple of days missed? And really, if you kept going by just sun up, sun down, sun up, sun down, it was a 7-day cycle.
Yeah, see, the calendar and the days of the month don't affect counting to 7.
No, I know, but if
So
you
there's
get,
no way. So
if
okay,
they definitely called that day. Say, for example, I'm wrong, and I know there's some nuances to it, but say they chopped out a couple of days, left a few days off, rebooted the calendar, and Saturday was called Saturday and kept on going.
Well, that didn't affect the days of the week. It didn't affect the counting of the week.
How do we know that though? What if there
Because
was 3 days?
we've got calendars from that time. We've got the evidence of how they proposed it, how Pope Gregory, because that was his initiative, how he fixed that. But here's another way we know that, because the Gregorian, you're talking 1582. It didn't say, like, Pope Gregory didn't say this is going to be the new calendar, and then the entire world of the time adopted it. There are countries that didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar that were still using the Julian calendar until the World War One. Until World War One, until the Bolsheviks, Russia was still keeping the Julian calendar. So Russia and all of the what became the Soviet Union only adopted the Gregorian calendar when the Soviet Union formed.
What about during Christ's time? They didn't even have the 7 days of the week then, did they? The Romans didn't have.
They had 8 days,
Monday to Saturday. Yeah. So
they named them A through G.
So
they were lettered.
So the Jews would then have had to cycle some day. Their Saturday would have shifted to different days of the Roman calendar.
Yep.
So some days it would have been the Roman Friday, and some days the Roman Saturday, and some days the Roman Sunday would have been their Saturday. At what point did the Sunday to Saturday come into play in a regular 7-day cycle?
I'm not exactly sure on when it happened, and I think it took a little bit of time, because you're talking about a massive empire, and it would have rolled out over time, just like the Gregorian. It rolled out over centuries in our world. It took a while for even the Julian calendar, and because before the Julian, it was like these, and the Julian calendar was to solve a problem of how do we keep timekeeping. Again, Julian calendar has to do with the year, not with the weekly cycle, which for the Romans was 8 days. So they Yeah, there's no record of time lost in all of that. The Jews, like, one day of those 8 was market day, and the Jews would sometimes be not able to turn up on market day. That's just how it was. But it would only affect them in the more Roman areas. So there's not a single case. I mean, it's to the point where as Hebrew as the Roman Empire became Christian under Constantine, biblical ideas came to seep into the Roman Empire. And then as Latin became the Romance languages, which then became French and Italian and German, these languages, as these dialects became languages and cemented within geographical areas, the name for Saturday in many of them is a form of Sabbath, Sabbatu, or many different ways. Now, this is the transition. So even just the formation of language tells us that there's no time loss. No one's calling any day other than none of these languages that are forming in this time period call any day other than our Saturday a form of Sabbath.
So what you're suggesting is that if we were back there in Israel, Jesus is walking the earth. If we could then repeat, so we see Jesus, we walk in behind him on the Sabbath day, we fellowship with Jesus, keep the Sabbath with him. If you and I then counted every 7 days from that moment to now, it would still be the same 7-day Sabbath cycle, even though all sorts of calendar things would have shifted around it.
Yeah, 100%. Calendars can transpose over the top. You can take our 7-day cycle and you can transpose the Arabic calendar. You can transpose the Chinese calendar. Like these are calendars that, like, they'll use the Gregorian for but they have their own calendars in these countries, in these regions,
right,
that are their own thing. So you can transpose. That's the thing about a count. You can just take the number of columns from the Roman 8, shift it to 7, and market day will just start to do this every.
Yeah. And I guess the Jews were able to be flexible on that, whether it was market day or not, they would keep the 7.
Yeah.
But are we sure that we are keeping the Saturday? I guess according to your assessment that 7-day cycle has kept going, and all of a sudden we're coming through time now. You and I are coming through time every 7 days. It's a Saturday, and I'll just bring up this quickly. Barry Ford, hey Barry, has said the 7-day week began with Constantine in 300. So we're going along the 299 years, 300 years. We're keeping that Sabbath, and all of a sudden the 7 days comes in, and we go, awesome. It's dovetailing. The Saturday's coming in with Constantine. It's dovetailing with our 7-day cycle. Is that your claim?
Well, that makes sense as well, because we know that there's an unbroken. So we don't have just the Jews. We have the Christians who are moving away. There's a point at which the Christians, especially in Alexandria and Rome, are moving away from Sabbath to Sunday, to the first day of the week. And so for them to move to the first day, they still have to have a cognition of what the 7th day. And so first day keeping is another example of how we can know when the 7th day is, because they're keeping the first day respective to the 7th. And so Constantine, that does make sense, Barry. I think it was around that. I just didn't have it in my head. But Constantine becomes a Christian, and then he adopts a lot of Christian ideas. And so the 7-day cycle is Judeo-Christian. He's adopting that from Judeo-Christian practice, and he's bringing it and incorporating it into the new empire. Yeah.
So who invented the term lunar Sabbath, and did the Jews ever keep a lunar Sabbath? Did they keep an eye on the moon, the sun, and the earth to select what day was the Sabbath?
Not at all. So I'll give you 2 things that are generally, like, I'll give you a bit of a history lesson on this lunar Sabbath idea.
Yeah.
The idea of a lunar Sabbath can be taken from certain encyclopedias, such as the Jewish Encyclopedia, which have a very higher critical bent. So higher criticism is approaching the Bible from a point of view of, this is a human construct. It's not a divinely inspired writing. It's a human construct, and therefore it is going to be influenced by the cultures around it. And so in the critical section of the Jewish encyclopedia, there have been, just like there's people who reject creation, ex nihilo, or create, like they'll say, oh, this is influenced by the Enuma Elish or the Gilgamesh account or whatever. They go, okay, well, what sounds like Sabbath in the surrounding nations? And so they've looked at the fact that there was a Sapatu, I think it is, in the Babylonians, which was a day. So if you would count the first day of the lunar cycle as a Sapatu, you'd have then, no, sorry, the first day would be day 1, then the 7th, the 14th, the 21st, and the 28th of the lunar cycle would be, now these weren't rest days, these were feast days for them, according to the Babylonians. And so in the Jewish encyclopedia, they say, well, Jews adopted a Sabbath keeping practice after their exile in Babylon, and so or may have done. They always use this prevaricating language, like may have adopted after their time in exile, influenced by the Babylonians. That's where the genesis of this idea of a lunar Sabbath comes from, is from these questions from higher critics in Germany. So this was Germany became a hotbed of higher criticism in the 1800s, in the mid 1800s. And so this is where that idea basically came from, and it's found its way into things like the Jewish Encyclopedia, like other encyclopedias which are not taking the approach that this is a divinely inspired book. In modern practice, so even with that, no well-known practice of lunar Sabbath keeping was known until the 1990s. Okay. In the 1990s, there was a guy, a anti-Semite white supremacist, and I don't throw those around lightly, those words. He actually was. He was convicted of a hate crime of shooting, like he was a getaway driver, I think, shooting a church. He actually was a Christian. I don't call that Christian behavior, but a synagogue. He was a getaway driver. He was convicted and put in jail. His name was Jonathan David Brown. Jonathan David Brown, you can look this up. And in prison, while serving time for a racist act, he claims that he had a divine revelation that the Sabbath was according to the moon. And so in that process, he writes this book called Yahweh's Timekeeping, I think it is. And he writes this book, and it starts to filter into some, just weird, it's a weird book. Some people I like to read weird books. I like to read weird things. And some people picked it up and they thought, oh, this sounds credible. Okay. And so that started to seep out. And eventually those types of people made their way, like that, made its way into Adventism, into the fringes of Adventism. And Kerry was mentioning people like the Vornholtz. So the earliest people I know of within Adventism who were pushing this were Elaine and Laura Vornholt. Laura's was Vornholt Jones. And they, according to their own, and I came across their stuff in the 2008, I think it was. And they had come across a conversation, someone who had adopted the lunar Sabbath, had convinced them of the lunar Sabbath in 2006, end of 2006, I think, or early, somewhere in 2006. And so in 2006, they're starting to bring this in, and Kerry said that they wrote a letter to all the pastors, and the pastors, no pastors adopted it. Doug Batchelor, who cares? Doug Batchelor probably gets 1,000 letters, a week. He's not going to read all of them. His secretaries are probably not going to even get to read all of them. Okay, and so no one accepting it is not an evidence that it's true. And they then attached a whole conspiracy theory around it, and that this conspiracy theory I do want to talk about is that the church, they allege that the church was informed of the lunar Sabbath relationship in the 1930s, and this is what Kerry was saying, and that they had secret councils, and the church had rejected it because it would be too hard to convince the people. Now, that's the conspiracy theory that has arisen. I can disprove and debunk that conspiracy theory today. So I'm able to debunk that as
Go
well as
for it.
biblically. Okay, so you want to do that first, and then we
Do
can get
that.
up to the biblical.
Do
Because
that first.
I can then go to the Bible and prove from various evidences that the lunar Sabbath it just can't work. It doesn't fit what we would call synchronisms that we can account for in the Bible. So back in 1938, there was a council, like a committee. There was a committee to study timekeeping. And the way that Kerry Wynn presented it and the way that the Vornholtz present it is this way. I'll first present what they say. The idea is that this guy by the name of J.H. Wirtz, okay, and you remember he mentioned J.H. Wirtz, and you asked in the video, how do you spell that? Let me get you the spelling. His full name was John Hubert Wirtz. Wirts, and some spellings are with a Z instead of an S at the end. Okay, so if you look in literature for his name, you can try typing with a Z and an S at the end. He was a German. He actually was born in Germany and came over to America. Let me actually read you his obituary. How about I do that? I found his obituary today just by having a search. So John Hubert Wirtz was born actually in Holland. Sorry, he was born in Holland, Europe. He was German speaker. December 19, 1867, and passed on to his rest in the Walker Memorial Hospital, Avalon Park, Florida, November 21, 1951. But when but a young man, he came to America to make his home. It was in his early years that he attended a series of meetings conducted by Dr. Fulmer in the state of Iowa and took his stand to keep all the commandments of God. He united with the Seventh-day Adventist Church and later studied in Union College, Lincoln, Nebraska. It was in the year 1913 that he met Bertha Flom, whom he married in 1914, and who thus joined him in his long years of ministry in many places throughout the United States. To this devoted union were born two children, Ruth and Paul. For nearly 50 years, Elder and Mrs. Wirtz labored untiringly to extend the Adventist truths wherever they were called. For some years, he designed and made prophetic charts that were used as visual aids in the evangelistic work of his fellow ministers all over the United States. Elder Wirtz was an ardent and able student of the scripture. He not only was a deep student of the Bible, but he did much to harmonize the Bible with astronomy. He was considered one of our ablest astronomers. God has signally blessed his efforts in this field of labor as well as his ministry through the years to the glory of his name. Another dauntless warrior has fallen. His life is a challenge to the younger men who are carrying on in the ministry. From the day he entered the ministry, taking up the proclamation of the great prophetic truths of the Bible, he never turned back. He fell with his face towards the city of God. He leaves to mourn his wife, his daughter Ruth, and his son Paul H. Wirtz, 3 grandchildren, and a host of friends. As we laid him to rest, it was with a fond hope that we shall see him again in that glad morning of the resurrection. So this is a guy who never abandoned Adventism. He died after 50 years of ministry within the Adventist Church. So at no point did he go, well, you guys haven't accepted my lunar Sabbath idea, I'm going. He remained a teacher of the Sabbath, of the 7-day cycle Sabbath. So and here's another thing that Kerry and these others, they talk about this paper that Wirtz wrote that's been sealed up and locked or destroyed or whatever. And then they go and tell you that it had to do with the lunar Sabbath. Well, how do they know? If no one's seen it, how do they know it was about the lunar Sabbath? So it's like one of those cake and eat it too sort of things. You know, there's this paper, it's been destroyed, and what it said was this. Well, how do you know? No one is able to, like, I've read all of their literature, the lunar Sabbatarian literature on this. They just infer what this would be, what this content was in this paper. I'll tell you what it was and why they met as a committee in 1938. And it wasn't because Wirtz wrote this amazing challenge to Sabbath keeping. It was about the Ballingers. You know the Ballingers? Yeah. So the Ballingers had a newspaper that they started soon after they left Adventism called The Gathering Call. You're familiar with that?
Yeah.
And in 1938, I don't think both of them were alive. I think one of them was dead by this stage. But in 1938, we're in a situation where they put an article in there, Gathering Call, that was challenging a Friday crucifixion in 31 AD. They'd also this was a part of a series of articles challenging our prophetic waymarks, like October 22, 1844.
Mm.
And so this committee had nothing to do with Wiertz, answering Wiertz. It was answering the challenge of the gathering call, which was gathering a bit of steam at the time. And so they're like, well, okay, everyone who was alive in 1844 with knowledge of what happened is dead. How do we, in a new generation, account for what is going on here? Does that make sense? So, so that is what they, and Wiertz wasn't a member of the committee, but he had, because he was interested in astronomy, they had asked him to submit a paper to give his answer to this stuff. And they rejected it on certain grounds. And those grounds were that he was using a day line for the lunar cycle that was in America, not in, you know, somewhere like Jerusalem. So there were certain reasons, and he got very cranky with them for rejecting his way of getting to to getting to these dates.
Mm.
And to the point where he wrote a scathing letter to Froome, who was one of the main people on this committee, after Grace Amadon died, and I'll get into her in a moment, after she died, saying that, you know, she was such a nuisance, and people were, you know, she was just an amateur, and people were upset that she was going to observatories and stuff like that. He actually, you know, some of it was lies, some of it, and I can prove that they were lies. So Wiertz is not a credible witness. His only paper is not even to be found. So these people just make up speculation about what the paper was, plugging their own hobby horse into it, which is not an intellectually honest thing to do. You know, produce the paper and then make the claim, or produce something that tells us what the paper was about and then make the claim. Don't do all of this other stuff. And then they talk about other councils and other committees that have met within Adventism, but everyone's sworn to secrecy. Well, how do you know what it's about then? If the person that you carry, if the person that you specifically know won't talk to you about what they said, how do you know then that it was about this? That's an easy thing that you could just plug and play any doctrine divergence into and say, oh, this is what it was about. I think that this is a topic that we need to be very careful that we, you know, dot our I's and cross our T's on, especially when we're I'm someone who's very open to conspiracy ideas. I mean, we've just lived through COVID. Like, how could you not think that there's some things that are shady that go on? But I still have a scientific mind that's like, okay, I need to be able to back it up, because I know that there's a lot of things that are out there to discredit these ideas that might be brought forth. So Grace Amadon, and a lot of this material comes from this person called Grace Amadon. She was the granddaughter of John Byington, who was one of the pioneers of the Adventist Church, the first president, I believe, of the Adventist Church. And she was the daughter of George Amadon, who was another pioneer, or second generation. Sorry, let me just grab my drink.
Yeah. I like your small glass there.
Yeah.
I'll have a little sip from mine. There's still 2 available if anyone wants one.
If they come in this size, I'll be happy to grab one.
How much is that? Like 2 liters?
That's a 1 liter. It's a 2 pint. So it's a 2 pint glass, and it's got lemon water in it. That's nice. My coffee.
Nice.
So for you. I'm not very good at drinking, at staying hydrated. I only drink 2 cups a day. Yeah. So Grace Amadon was, to all intents and purposes, she was a spinster. She was a lovely lady who spent all her life in ministry to the church. I guess you could call her an Adventist nun. Never married, never. She just served in various capacities within the General Conference, it would seem. And she was on this committee because she had taken up, as she began to care for her elderly parents, she had taken up a lifetime of hobby study of astronomy, similar to Wiertz, who was just a pastor, who was studying it to seek to understand and better be informed about the different parts of what Adventism was teaching. So there was 2 women on this committee, which for the 1930s is quite remarkable. They weren't there as secretaries; they were there as contributors to the committee. The other woman, her her name was Julianne Neufer. And so this committee had Walter Reed as the chairman, Merwin Thurber as secretary. There were people like Leroy Froome, Siegfried Horn, Milton Kern, Frederick Lee, Denton Reebok, Homer Teasdale, Lynn Wood, Frank Yost. So those were, and there was probably Ben Wilkinson as well, Benjamin Wilkinson. These were people that were a part of this committee to study the things like astronomy, history. How did the pioneers, how did the Millerites get to 1844? Like, how did they get those dates? And so in dealing with this, Grace Amadon, her contribution was amazing, because she goes into, okay, I'm going to, like, her mindset was to seek to find evidence from Second Temple period of Judaism, not post Second Temple, but Second Temple. What were the writings and the practices that illuminate the Jewish practice before the temple was destroyed? When the temple was destroyed, there was a massive brain drain within Judaism. Most of the Sanhedrin was killed at that point. All of their knowledge was lost. Imagine all their knowledge being lost. There's a story about the indigenous peoples of Tasmania and their lack of fire. When the Europeans came there, they had no fire. And one of the proposed ideas of how this happened was that a sickness had wiped out all the adults at one point, leaving only children, and leaving a much less, like, they didn't know how to make it. So when there was fire, they would stop warring with other indigenous tribes in Tasmania to exchange fire, because it was that precious to them. And so this is, reconstructing their stories. This may have been what happened. And so imagine with the Jews, they've lost all of their knowledge base, all of the people who had trained and taught on how things work from a Jewish practice perspective died in AD 70. They had a new Sanhedrin that was reconvened, I think, in Petra or something, and that only got worse after the Bar Kokhba revolt, when they were ousted from all of Judea. So that was in 135. And so we have this situation where Jews have lost their knowledge. So Amadon is looking at before the destruction of the temple, looking at the writings of Philo Judaeus, of Josephus, of Aristobulus, looking at what the Bible evidence is. There's a few hints of the Bible, and she reconstructed rules that fit with synchronisms that we know from history and that we know from the Bible. And she was very, very good in that. It's amazing. I believe that she's one of the first Adventists who was published in peer-reviewed literature outside of Adventism. She had several articles that appeared in the Journal of Biblical Literature, and in, where was the other one? In the Anglican Theological Review. So she's getting into these places. She was introduced by Glenn Draper of the U.S. Naval Observatory to another colleague, W.F. Albright, which is a well-known name within evangelical Christianity. And he introduced her like this. He says, as to the rules of calendation employed by the ancient Jewish people, we have been, and now this is a guy who's just the director of the U.S. Naval Observatory. He says, we have been in more or less total darkness. The few threads of information which we are able to glean from the records indicate that the ancient calendar rules were astronomically sound, requiring more knowledge of the motions of the sun and moon than has been credited to the ancient Jewish people. One cannot say that Miss Amadon's calendar rules are the ancient canons, so long as we do not have more authentic statements from the ancient Jews themselves. All that we can ever hope for is to reproduce formulae which consistently synchronize with the few definite records of the past. No investigator of ancient Jewish time has thus far found rules of lunar calendation which accomplish this quite as well as the rules which Miss Amadon has discovered. I merely desire to say that astronomically the rules are sound and that they are apparently in harmony with the data of the ancient records. Therefore, I am pleased to subscribe to the belief that the ancient Jewish people had rules that, if not those of Miss Amadon, at least synchronized with them. That's high praise from a director of the U.S. Naval Observatory. And this is in what's known as the Grace Amadon collection. And the Grace Amadon collection, when I first discovered some of this material, it was when I was studying at Avondale in 2001. And I'd love to go down into the vault and see some of this material that was in the vault. It was fascinating to me. I didn't grow up Adventist, didn't grow up Christian. So the fact that there was a vault at all was just highly interesting to me. And I discovered this stuff, and as a 17-year-old, I had no clue what I was reading, because I'm not a trained astronomer. I came and rediscovered it in like 2005, and I started to read textbooks on astronomy to understand this. Because in 2005, I went through a bit of a crisis of faith. I had gotten involved with a very extreme cult version of Adventism. Another topic we could talk about. Yeah. And so I came back after that crisis, going, how do I know anything that I've accepted as true? So I started grabbing things like Des Ford's, Glacier View, and other things that he'd written. I'm like, I want to see if I can answer these challenges. And I can answer most of them. There's a few that don't have any evidence either way, but most of the challenges I can answer from Ford and other critics. When it comes to prophetic waymarks, when it comes to a lot of other things, I found this Grace Amadon material, and at first glance it didn't make sense. So I can understand how people like Elaine Vornholt and Laura Vornholt can read it and get the wrong ideas of what this committee are talking about. These letters between M.L. Andreasen, who came onto the committee at some point, and Amadon and Froome. It, like, you've really got to re-educate, become educated in astronomy to understand what they're talking about. And so they see these lines, and they extrapolate a conspiracy out of it. But really, it was just dealing with, is there a Friday crucifixion in 31 AD? And is the Day of Atonement in 1844, October 22? And those were the two questions that they were asking. Nothing at all. So anything lunar in that was about the calendar that gets you the months.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with Sabbath. Yeah.
Was two things. Was there evidence to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the Friday based on the lunar and the Passover, and that it most likely would have been what we would call Wednesday now?
No, so it's not about whether it was Wednesday or Friday that they were looking at. Wednesday crucifixion doesn't fit the Passion Week narrative. It just doesn't. Wednesday and Thursday, there are some that also have Thursday. Neither of those fit the Passion Week narrative. The question is which year. So most Christians believe that.
Sorry, that was my next thing of the two things. One is the midweek, and also which year.
So they weren't entertaining a different day of the week at that point. They were like, it's outside of recent history, again, like the lunar Sabbath, there hasn't been a lot of challenge towards a Friday crucifixion, just because it's prima facie obvious from the Passion Week narrative. We can account for that whole week. But and I can deal with that at another time if you get a guest on wanting to.
The year is more interesting.
Yeah, so most Christians will have a 30 AD or a 33 AD Friday crucifixion. And they say there can't be a Friday crucifixion on 31 AD. It's just impossible. And this is where the calendar was. This is where they were getting into it. See,
as in getting into the lunar side of it.
Well, they were getting into we know how the Jews currently. There's two ways the Jews currently, two main ways the Jews currently reckon the calendar. There's three if you count the Samaritans. The rabbinical Jews, have a 19-year cycle that was created in the 4th century by Hillel II. Hillel II was mentioned by Kerry, and this is after 300 and something years of that brain drain that I'm talking about. Remember, they lost everyone, and so they're going through a period where they've been scattered, they've been dispersed, they're not in Judea anymore. They're coming back to Judea, some of them, because it's a bit more favorable under Constantine. They're in this position where they're going, okay, how do we reckon the year again? And so Hillel II gleaned bits and pieces that had trickled down like we can't say Chinese whispers anymore, like telephone, like a game of telephone. And he's going, okay, well, we know there was a 19-year cycle, and he just gets the cycle wrong. We know that it's tied to the vernal equinox, but instead of being if you go and you synchronize everything according to the ancient evidence that is Second Temple, it's tied to the vernal equinox like this. It's the first new moon after the vernal equinox that starts the year. Now, and it's the first new moon season. So that includes from conjunction to new moon. That's another part. But so it's the first new moon season that starts the year is after the vernal equinox. Now, the way Hillel calculated it was it's the closest new moon to the vernal equinox that starts the year, which means that half the time, or about actually 60% of the time, the Jewish Hillel second calendar, which all rabbinical Judaism uses today, is a month early. Half of 60% of the time, about 57% of the time, they're going to be a month early, just because of the wrong relationship to the vernal equinox. Then you've got the Karaites. The Karaites are often used in terms of, oh, this is how the Millerites came to 1844. Well, I'll get to that in a moment. So the Karaites, they came about in the 1800s, 1800 AD. They were kind of an attempt to reform Judaism back to, from the Hillel II, back to what they considered more biblical. And they said, no, we need to have a barley harvest observation. We need to be able to see the abib, the ripe grain. And so they were seeking, this is when they're coming back into Palestine. They're like, no, we need to count it from a barley harvest. This got really complicated when you don't have planes and everything, and you've got Karaite communities in Russia who can't, just pick up the phone and say, was there a barley harvest? So they started to go by local harvest according to various areas. And then you've got the Samaritans, which were different again, and they're a very small community anyway. And so you've got these main Hebraic or Semitic ways of trying to calculate and none of them agreed with 1844, the cycle that the Adventists had just then. So, let's have another drink. So Froome, because the Millerites mentioned the Karaite communities, they initially, this committee were like, let's try and find a Karaite calendar for 1844. And in this correspondence of Grace Amadon, there are dozens and dozens of letters from Froome going out to people seeking to ask, can you give me a calendar? Like, he's writing universities and Jewish authorities in Egypt and in Palestine, and he finally gets a calendar, hoping that it's going to say October 22, not September 23. And what does it say? It says September 23. Okay. Now, this is after the committee. This is after the committee that he eventually gets this. And then if you're going to talk about anything being buried, he buried that.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
That was buried. Now, I don't agree that the Karaites should have been a reason for, like, they're so far removed from the destruction of the temple as an attempt to reform things based on a lack of knowledge of how things worked in the Second Temple period.
I agree.
So the Karaites, they were mentioned. The Millerites didn't mention them as they have affirmed. Like, there's nothing in all of the Midnight Cry or the Signs of the Times during 1843, 1844 that tells us that the Karaites had observed barley and which day it was. They were used as an idea to formulate and plant a seed that the Jewish rabbinical calendar is not the only calendar you could go by. And then the Millerites started to go into astronomy. Now, here is where I wanted to talk about the calendar in general before we get into lunar Sabbath. There's a calculated and an observed element to the calendar, to the biblical calendar. God said that the sun, moon, and stars are for signs and seasons and days and years. And yet they reckoned the year by the barley. Well, was the barley to determine or to confirm the year? What happened in a Sabbath year? In a Sabbath year, they weren't harvesting. So there's no barley harvest to go by. Does that mean they don't know when? No, of course they do. The calendar had to be reliable enough so that if you're going from, like if I'm going somewhere, I make an appointment, I'm going to be there on October whatever, or I'm going to be there on November whatever. They had to know this for just civil and functional reasons. And so that they always had a calculated calendar, but God instigated the observation so that you are looking for the incoming. They were so. Let me just read something from the Talmud about how I guess you could say sophisticated their understanding was of the way that the heavens work. So they had what was known as the Sod Habor. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but the Sod Habor was this committee that was part of like a subcommittee of the Sanhedrin, and they would meet in the they were the ones responsible for the lunar calculation or the calendar rules and the reckoning. And so the Sod Habor, when someone came to say, I've observed the new moon, they were brought into what's known as the Beth Din. That's the house of judgment. That's where Jesus was on trial, in the Beth Din. And they would be brought in before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin would say, tell us what form you saw the moon. Was it before or behind the sun? Was it to the north or south of the sun? What was its elevation on the horizon? Towards which side was its inclination? You know, the moon can be doing, the crescent can be doing this sort of stuff depending on the time of year. What was the width of its disk? These are extremely like if you read into it, you go, oh, they're asking about things like apogee and perigee and making sure that you understood. Now Kerry said, well, what happens if there's if there's a storm and you can't see the moon? It's overcast. Well, they knew when it was going to be. They'd just declare the month. They would just declare the month without observation. The observation was so that we can see the workings of God coming in. And so same with the barley harvest. The barley harvest, what about years of famine? When they were disobedient and there was famine. They still knew when to start the year because of the vernal equinox. It was all calculated, and observation was just God's way of us being intimately and interactively connected to his timings. Does
like
that make
for
sense?
analogy, if you chopped off a couple of fingers, you still know you've got 5 in that hand.
Oh, yeah, you can
Whether
still
it's
count to
covered up
7.
or not, you still know that that's the month.
Exactly. So that's the, it was intricate. They knew about it, and so when Hillel comes in, they've lost that. The Karaites, they've lost all of that. We know that because we've gleaned this. Grace Amadon has done a great work. Other people who had access to resources we don't anymore. And what I mean by that is, the great Joseph Scaliger, who was a Calvinist astronomer and theologian in the 1500s. He did a lot of work on collecting a lot of these evidences, which are now lost. Why? Because we've had 2 world wars that have just blown up all the libraries in Europe. There's a lot of materials lost to us now, but he had documented and gone through and he's referenced it. We can't check his references because they're all destroyed. But not all of them, but many of them are destroyed. So we've been able to piece together something that fits the Elephantine papyri, the biblical stories, that we can figure out a timing for, and I'll go into those in a minute, which don't fit with the lunar Sabbath. Would you like to go there soon?
Yeah? Yes. Can I just ask a question? Because I love using, analogies and symbolic kind of picturing and metaphorical kind of language to help me grasp these kind of concepts.
Yeah.
So what you're saying there is to accurately maintain this 7-day cycle, we are having to piece together lots of information and from previous people.
No. That's to piece together the months, the calendar, like the months.
Yeah, the general calendar.
The 7-day cycle. We also have to piece together just the fact that all these communities kept the same day as the Sabbath, going outwards from Jerusalem.
Yeah,
the same count of 7.
So 2 things, and using an analogy again, you and I are on a desert island. You've got your border town tribe on one side of the island. I've got my Voice Life Fellowship tribe on the other side of the island. And we want to gather together, every Saturday, just to, commune and celebrate life and the creation of the world.
Yeah.
And so we have a chat about how we're going to do that, because we've come to this island without any historical information. All the books are gone. It's just really plonked on the island. Here we are living there, living off the land. And we suggest, look, do we just count? We want to meet every 7 days. Do we just count the sun, and every time it's the seventh one, we go to our big wall chart on a rock over here, and we put a line and another line, 4, then cross them. So we've got our little groupings to count, and every 7 days we just keep a track of it like that. Or do we go, hey, we've noticed that, look, we can use the moon, the sun, the earth to get a really accurate, there's the full moon, let's count 7 days. We can reset if there's a problem. If, say, for example, if there's a massive storm and the wind and the rain remove our little notches that have been keeping a record of the 7-day cycle, and we go, oh, hang on, did we count properly there? If we go on the lunar sun and earth rotation mechanism clock, we can recalibrate and get it accurate again. Why would God not want us to use a more accurate mechanism to keep track of this very important cycle, rather than allowing for all sorts of human piecing together and fabrication and deconstructing to happen, like the storm removing our numbers on a rock?
Yeah.
Surely God would come down to us and say, guys, look, just follow the clock I've put in the sky. Wouldn't that be a much better mechanism? And why? And many peoples of the world, or tribes, or cultures have used the lunar calendar to keep up with their traditions and celebrations. Like, that's a fact. So why wouldn't we follow that really great clock in the sky and follow this other one that can cause a lot of confusion?
Well, I'm a both and person. In fact, I believe that there's still, I don't just keep the Sabbath. I believe that the Jewish feast days are also days of blessing. They can be times of blessing, communing together, remembering what that part of the calendar tells us about the plan of salvation. Whether it's
would you use the moon to help you remember those days?
Of course, you have to, because those are tied to the moon.
So why wouldn't you use the moon then to help you keep a record of the Sabbath?
Because the Sabbath is not tied to the moon. There's nowhere in Scripture that ties the Sabbath to the moon, but there are statements that tie the feast to the moon. A classic one is Psalm chapter 81, verse 3. It ties the feast to the moon. So the Sabbath is according to a cycle that God started through His activity, and it runs throughout. And yes, I'll talk about this in a minute. Yes, sometimes the Passover can fall on a Sabbath, according to the biblical idea. Sometimes other days could fall on the Sabbath. These are things that are not a problem in biblical or Torah ethics. Torah ethics doesn't have a problem with that, because if you're doing, 7 days they marched around Jericho, so one of those days would have been a Sabbath. Doesn't have a problem to me. If God commands you to do something, then obedience is rest. Obedience to that command is rest. If you're having to cook a Passover meal on the Sabbath, that's fine, because it's worship. It's part of the worship. As I said, it's my busiest day of the week. I'm setting up church. I have to go and set everything up. I preach. I play music. I prepare a sermon on the Friday night. I'm still preparing my sermon on the Friday night into the wee hours of the morning. It's a busy day for me. I'm ministering. I'm going and visiting people who weren't at church afterwards. It's a full day.
So 2 other quick things before we move on with what else you're going to say there. And we're going to have our short refreshment break. We do that now every hour we get into a program. A lot of people have requested it, and so I have obliged. So we'll do that in a moment. But
I need a refill.
Then you can do a refill. You're making me thirsty. I've got some water out there. I'll grab as well. So firstly, the lady, again, I keep forgetting her name, and I did during Kerry's interview too, Amadon.
Grace Amadon.
Yes. Did she, in looking at this topic and looking at trying to work out the 31 AD or the 33 AD, did she explore using the lunar calendar to help her with that? And
that's all that she was talking about. The whole lot of
that's what I thought. Yeah,
everything. So for the feast days, they are tied to the moon. So that's Passover. Like Passover, whenever Passover is, and that will coincide with a day of the week. Passover can be a Wednesday, it can be a Thursday, Friday, Monday, whatever day.
And so did they conclude that it was 31 or 33? You did say, I've just forgotten.
They did conclude that it was 31, and I believe their reasoning is sound, based
And
because
that-
they were using, if you don't go to Second Temple evidence, then you can get 33 or 30. But if you go to Second Temple, it's 31.
So she used the moon to help come to that conclusion.
Without our computer modeling that we have today, it's amazing. She had graphs and charts and tables.
Yeah,
I can just type into a program, and I can tell you the phase. I can tell you the phase for any day in history.
Yeah.
Going back thousands.
And does that indicate then that William Miller and the movement used the lunar calendar, the lunar calendar, to arrive at 1844?
Interestingly, I've gleaned as much as I can on how they got there from articles like the Midnight Cry, the True Midnight Cry, Adventist, the Advent Review and Signs of the Times, which was not the one that the Adventist Church had. It's the Millerite version.
Yeah.
I've gone through all of these, and it's interesting. They only mention the Karaites very rarely, but they mention the astronomy a lot. And a lot of the things that Amadon brought out from her research, I've found reference to Aristobulus or Philo-Judaeus and Josephus within these Millerite writings, showing that they were on the right track. They weren't barking up a Karaite tree. That was just it was a starting point for them to go, hey, not all of the Jews that are currently alive keep the same calendar. Maybe it's not the same way that the Jews do today.
So are you saying, and if that's the case, that William Miller did use astronomy, the lunar calendar, to come to 8031?
Not William Miller. So not William Miller didn't embrace October 22 until like the month of October. This was other Millerites. So this was people like Samuel Snow and others who built upon works before them even. Yeah,
that's true. He was resistant to coming up with another date.
Yeah.
But those that did, as a part of the movement, eventually landed on 8031. They did use the lunar calendar to get there. That extrapolates to 1844.
Yeah.
I'd suggest that it's probably September 23, not October 22.
I actually think it's October 22, 23.
Yeah.
Because it's sunset to sunset. That's another thing no one ever talks about.
That's true.
You know, it's got to straddle the day somehow. Is it 21, 22, or is it 22, 23?
And that's another very interesting topic, because that means that
when they gave up at
great
midnight,
disappointment was a month later.
Well, no. I think that
by mistake.
Well, you think September. I think October is correct. I just think that when they gave up at midnight, there was still another 18 hours of the Day of Atonement left.
Of hope.
Of the Day of Atonement. Well, it's interesting that, what's his name is walking through the field the next day, and Edson.
I know it so well, and I've got a mental blank too.
Yeah.
Hiram
Edson. Yeah, Hiram Edson. He's walking through the field on the morning of October 23. It's still the Day of Atonement when he has that vision. So when he has that vision, that's another interesting thing.
It's giving him an inaccurate understanding, because he realizes he doesn't get that a particular time period hasn't concluded yet.
Well, I think it's actually true. Like, we could talk about that another time. We could talk about October 22, 23, September another time. But for me, at this point, just answering that question is they were even before the October, because remember they'd falsely predicted 43 AD.
Yes,
1843. And so they were already doing the astronomy. So yeah, Miller was engaged in astronomy with that.
Yeah.
They were engaged with it because they were looking for when's the Passover, when's the first of the moon. Yeah.
And I guess what I'm saying is that if they did use it then, why wasn't it something that they went on to use? And you're saying, tell me if I'm wrong, that yes, you can if you want to keep your lunar other celebrations.
Yes.
But with regard to the Sabbath, you keep to the other.
Yeah. So you were saying if you're wanting to keep a 1 day in 7, why if you're on an island, why can't you just do it according to the moon? Well, it's too complicated. You're not going to do 1 day in 7. According to lunar Sabbath, there's 2 different branches of lunar Sabbatarians. Some treat the first day of the month as a Sabbath. Others say it's a new moon and not a Sabbath. Okay, fine, whatever. But then they count from the first. That's day 1, and so then that's not a Sabbath, but it's sort of a Sabbath.
Yeah,
and then,
I was very confused about that in my
and then
first
it's not the
interview.
7th day of the month that's the Sabbath. It's the 8th day. So they're counting 6 days in between the 1st and then the 8th, and then it's the 15th and the 22nd and the 29th, and then maybe you'll have a 30th day before the new moon day. And so what's that? It's like and he called it, Kerry called it like non-days. I'm like, I'm sorry, but these are days. These are days that you're awake and you see life happening around you. They're not non-days.
But if God's interested in you keeping some kind of cyclical rhythm, that it's less likely to be wrong because you can recalibrate it every month.
Yeah, but the fact that you have to keep it, it's no longer cyclical. It's no longer cyclical according to a count of 7. The whole point of the Sabbath is, God worked 6 days and then he rested. And there's nothing in the 4th commandment to say, oh, by the way, there might just be a recalibration day every now and then.
But if God said, I want you, with our knowledge of the calendar right now, he said, look, from now on, I want you to treat the first day of the month as the Sabbath. That would be considered a cyclical keeping event, even though some would be 28, some would be 30, some would be 31.
Look, if our lunar cycle was 28 days, then it would coincide anyway with the Sabbath, because then you'd have 28 as divisible by 7. Because it's 29 or 30, depending on the month, and originally before the flood, I believe it was perfect 30. God's original creation was a perfect 30, because in the flood you have 5 months consecutively that are 100, because it says 5 months and it says 150 days, and the only way that's impossible after the flood.
But if you and I are on an island and we want to get our 2 tribes gathering every month, for example, all those stories could be myths. They could all be the telephone stories. And so what I'm saying to you is I'd say, look, when the moon goes big and round, let's make that our celebration day. And it doesn't matter if it's 31, 30, 29. It doesn't matter if it's out of sync, because our celebration day has an exact science. We don't have to be counting like, the day after is a sorty day and a semi day, a sort of day. We can go, every time it's a full moon, mate, we're going to catch up on that hill there and have a celebration around the fire. And so that becomes cyclical. So I'm just saying that there's ways to do it that don't require the mental gymnastics.
But there's another way that's just requiring this many fingers.
Yeah, but if you count importance on the 7th one and you lose track, or your kids die, only a couple of people survive and they didn't take on that information, they'd go, oh, hang on, what was the day again? Was it tomorrow or today?
And you know what? If that hypothetical happened, I don't think God would care if you got off track.
But if it's a salvation issue at some point, it would matter.
Some point. Look, I mean, eating a fruit can be a salvation issue.
So,
if it's conviction.
God doesn't mind if you have to recalibrate because we've made a mistake.
No, not at all.
But we have to mind.
Look, not at all. I think that anything that you're convicted of is a salvation issue, because it's wrong to go against your convictions.
Well, that's what Steve Scott was saying in his interview.
It's not a salvation issue. Unless it is.
God doesn't really care if you get it wrong and you recalibrate and start. And
you're talking about the most extreme of hypotheticals.
No, I think in history it's happened many, many times. Like you used the example of Tasmania, where the whole tribe possibly wiped out. The kids had to start again, and if all they
remembered was count to 7, and they got the wrong day in 7. When other people came in with that knowledge, they just recalibrate.
And look, I agree. I don't think it's important, and I don't think God thinks it's important. But what I'm saying is, if we think it's important to get the right 7th day, if there's a chance of that being messed up, shouldn't we be a bit concerned about that? Or do we go, we messed up, but we're just going to recalibrate?
Because we're not on an island, we're not in that state. Because we're not in an island, we've got all of history, we've got the resources of testimonies going all the way back. We're not in that state. If we're on an island and then we come back and we're like, oh man, I was in a coma for 2 days and I got the wrong count, I hit my head and I woke up and I counted from that day, based on what like. That would be different, but it's not. We're not in that state. We're not in that state. We have all of this evidence,
But
and
there's
it's not
people
according
that
to.
suggest we are in that state, and we have been in that state. The other thing, and that's something we could dig into more, but the other thing I wanted to talk about is if a supernatural being creates the solar system, the universe, the earth, there's people on it, why would he even care that there was a specific worship day kept every Saturday, every seventh day, using the seven fingers? Why would he even care if that happened? And why would he ever decide that, hey, I've created you guys, I'm going to bring you up here to my special realm of heaven, this perfect paradise, but only if you keep that seventh day? Why? Like, why would someone do that?
We're
Like,
kind of talking.
I would never say to my daughters, boy, unless you worship me every 7 days, you're not coming into my kingdom, or my paradise.
We're talking macro principles here, and I don't believe the Sabbath is a day of don'ts. I believe the Sabbath
But
is.
you said that one day it might be.
Look, I don't know. I deal with the here and now. I deal with the principles that I find myself in
But
right
do you
now.
believe that if the world governments say you have to keep the
If the
Sunday, the
world
Sabbath,
governments,
you would then make a stand and go, okay, well, I'm not going to?
if the world governments come and tell me anything that is contrary to biblical, I'll make a stand on that. If the world governments come and say you've got to euthanize your children and that's the breaking of the
And so
commandment, or
I'm
you've got
saying,
to.
why would God do that? Why would God create a scenario where you may or may not get to heaven if you don't oppose that world government?
Look, I think that I just did a study on why the judgment is good news. We have a very different view of the judgment in our Western understanding than the Hebrew Bible does. We fear judgment. We think that it's a bad news. There's no way that most people would present the judgment as part of the good news, right? But I think the judgment is part of the good news because the judgment is not about us. It's about God being judged. That's primarily the object of judgment in the Bible. You see that from the accusations of the accuser, Satan, back in Genesis 3. He's accusing God. We accuse ourselves. Adam and Eve condemned themselves. God didn't condemn them. He came to draw them. In fact, that was a type of an investigative judgment. God comes along investigating where they are, not because he doesn't know where they are, but to draw them to himself. He's having an investigation. He's saying, where are you? Where do you think you are, Adam and Eve? Not because God doesn't know. And so he draws them to himself by that, and he gives a restorative, curse, not on them, onto the ground. The ground is cursed. You're not cursed. The ground will be cursed, and you'll see the fruit of your choice. And within that there's the seed. You're going to have pain in childbearing, Eve, but there's going to be a seed. You're going to work and in toil and sweat, but there's redemption in that, Adam. And so God's judgment is not something that we should fear. The Hebrew writers cry out for God's judgments. When your judgments are in the earth, then the world learns righteousness. Please bring your judgments. That's the stance of the Jews. We don't have that because we associate judgment with condemnation. But judgment is also vindication. Judgment is also affirmation. God made a judgment every day of the creation week when he said, it's good. It's very good. That's a judgment. And when God judges, his natural mode is to judge positively.
But toil and drama and these things that refine us as human beings and draw us closer to God, I just can't imagine a parent saying to children that they've created in a world that unless you keep these very specific rules, you're not coming into the family eventually.
Yeah, see,
Like, I can understand that the kids there have been given this world to live in, and we're all children of this world. We're all, we're dealing with information we've got. We're not really, compared to the intelligence of the supernatural, we're the super being. We're not really that smart.
Yeah.
But if we're therefore placed as children in this world, yeah, we have toil and hardship and struggles and things that refine us. But why would a loving parent say, I can understand loving parents say, hey, I'm going to give you challenges. There's going to be judgment. There's going to be all this sort of stuff to refine you and to draw you to a closer understanding of me. But I can't understand why the parent, the loving parent, would say, but by the way, if you don't keep this very special day that I'm going to one day put the teachers that I've got down there ruling you, if you don't keep that, you are not going to come into this beautiful family home of love that I've created for you. I just can't imagine a loving God doing that.
I don't even read the Bible and come away with that message, though. I just don't read the Bible and come away with that message at all. What I'm seeing when I see what, and I'm just put Sabbath over there. When God puts Torah in our midst, it's not for the purpose of I'm testing you. I am the owner. I'm the creator. I'm the manufacturer. Here is the best optimal way for you to run. Now you can take a car and you can put the wrong sort of fuel in it, and it's not going to go very far. You can do the wrong things to it, and it's not going to go very far. When God is setting forth the commandments, they are the covenant. The 10 Commandments are the covenant, and not just the 10 Commandments. They're representative of all of Torah, and Torah is there as boundaries of right relationship. It's not that God is waiting with bated breath to go, you're out. That's not what I see that.
I love the analogy of the car there, and if you run out of fuel, and these are guidelines and boundaries to help you make your journey and to successfully go on your journey. If that's all the Bible claimed, that kind of analogy and metaphor, I'd go, great. But it doesn't just do that. It does do that, but it does include, and if you don't get to this certain level of achievement, you are not coming into heaven. So it's not just, hey, I'm helping you have a good life, and here's these things to give you boundaries to be better for you and to draw you closer to me. There's extra stipulations clearly outlined in the Bible that say, and by the way, if you don't do this, you're not coming to heaven. And I guess that's the one point I'm saying I find difficult to grasp, because on the one hand, you're kind of saying there's a universalist kind of, we're all going to be refined and get to heaven. I know you don't mean that. I know you don't. But if you don't, then you're saying that there are definitely end game rules that are going to come into play that will define you getting to heaven or not. I struggle with that. I know you and I are different on this, but I struggle with that God.
Well, I don't know that we're that different, because I think that you're probably like I'm 99.99999% atheist. I've never met a person who is agnostic or atheist who, when they describe the God that they don't believe in, I'm like, yeah, I don't believe in that God either. Or they don't think that it might be existing. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't sound like my God either. I think that those statements, if understood within a consequences scenario, as in like you're going to run yourself to the point where you're not going to be wanting to be in the heaven, in the paradise that I'm in. And so I'll honor that choice. God is life, and he's the only one who has immortality. And I believe that. I still believe that in the soul sleep and annihilation. And it's not because God wants to annihilate. It's if he is the source of life, he is honoring our choice not to be plugged in to that source of life. He's just removing life support. That's what the end judgment is going to be. It's like, okay, you don't want a part of me, and it's not, I'm going to punish you, therefore. I'm honoring your choice not to. You've chosen not life. There's life and not life, and you've chosen not life. And I'm not going to force you to have life. I'm not going to force you to have life when you've chosen not life. That's the
argument. That argument doesn't work for me. I find that, like I would never say to my girls, hey, well, if you don't do that, you've chosen not to be in the family.
Yeah, but that's because you're not a source of life. You're not a source of life.
I'm a source of their life.
No, you were a source of their life. God is continually a source of our life.
But if we're looking at right now, my 9 and 10-year-old daughters, your baby, you're never going to say, and my girls are old enough to understand concepts.
Yeah.
And I'm never going to say, hey, girls, in this time bubble we live in now, unless you love me like I want you to love me, and there's certain things you must do, you're not allowed in the house at night. I just can't understand a God ever doing that.
Yeah, but he's not kicking anyone out of the house right
Yeah,
now.
but
We're all
but
in the house.
they're begging to get Daddy, let us in. Sorry, it was your choice. I love you so much, but it was your choice to disobey me. Hey, you had freedom of a choice there, girl.
Yeah.
Sorry. Enjoy the cold because it was your choice.
Well, your
We're too
paradigm is very
limited as
much on
children.
doing. We're not human doings. God is more keen on
I'm the opposite of that. I'm
well, no, but
saying
the
that
way
I'm
that
not.
you're approaching
I
that.
I'm saying the opposite of that. I'm saying I would never do that. I'm saying whatever they do, they're in the house.
Yeah,
So
and
I'm the opposite of doing.
while I'm
I'm
not,
being. You get to be in this house no matter what. Like I'm a universalist in that sense.
mm,
I believe we're all on that path to heaven, and God's never going to block anybody. So I'm the opposite of a doing person.
yeah. So, but the way you're approaching the biblical data is as a doing person.
No, no,
You're
no. I'm critiquing those who follow that
yes.
paradigm as being doing people.
Well, let me point out that that might not be the only paradigm,
Mm.
of doing. God is God is declaring you are not going to be happy here. You are not going to make this happy.
By why? By what? By
By
because
the
of their
fact that
action?
they have cultivated over a lifetime a choice of not and it's not about Sabbath or anything, it's like forget those do's.
But did those choices manifest as actions and doings and not doings?
Yeah, they did,
So
but
it
but
is
those
about doing.
but all of us, like let's go to the doings for a second. None of us, according to the Bible, can get in there. None of us can
That's
get.
exactly right.
Yeah,
That's why I don't think it's a really good paradigm to try and even work out.
yeah. So none of us, I can't get in. I can't get in according to the standard. But I have access to one who did it, who did everything according to the standard and imparts to us, not just imputes,
So
but
you're outside of the house because of the things you didn't do or the things you did do, your choices.
we start
And
outside the
Jesus
house.
is outside saying, "It's okay, buddy. I'll put my blanket around you," knocks on the door and says, "Hey, parent, let the child in because of me."
Yeah, that view of the atonement doesn't work with me. Jesus didn't come to change anything about God. Jesus did not come
So
to
how do you get
change.
in the house then, in that
We
analogy?
Jesus didn't come to change anything about God. He came to just display what God was, what God already was, which was a God of love. He came to show what that looks like. Love is also honoring of freedom. We're looking at a paradigm here where God is the source of life, and if you reject God, you're rejecting life. That's just how it is. Like that's as simple as it is. And he will honor that. He's not going to force you to stay alive when you're rejecting him, who is the only way that you can stay alive.
But if my daughters reject me, they're still allowed in the house.
Yeah, you're using a house analogy when we're talking about life, though. It's a bit of a apples
Well,
and
you're talking
oranges.
about another realm that we're going to go to or not go to.
All of the realm, like we're alive
Home.
right now on.
So
No,
let's
home is
call
going
it
to be here.
home. Let's,
Home's going to be here eventually. So I mean, like that doesn't
yeah,
like
well, let's have my home analogy, but I just take down the walls one
okay.
day. The home analogy works. You're either
We all
outside the home or you're not outside the home. And I'm just saying that
we're
there's
all in the
nothing you can do
home.
to be outside the home.
We're all in the home to begin. Like in that sense, if we're going by that way, we're all starting off in the home.
Yeah.
And we might hate the home. And Jesus came to show, hey, no, this home is amazing. Look at how much this God, like how much my Father is going to do for you. And we go, no, I still hate it. God's not going to force you to stay.
But the door is always open in my analogy, whereas you're going to say one day the door's closed.
The door is always open to leave and leave God's home.
Yeah.
You start off in the home, so you're always open, and God's not going to force you to
I'm
stay.
saying the door's always open if you want to come back.
Yeah,
You're saying that one day that door will close.
I think that one day you'll get to a point where you like, and God, this is something that we know from neuroplasticity and science. One day your choices will become so hardened you won't even want to come back.
Yeah,
That's what this is all based on.
The point I'm making is that that the door is always open, but it's not whether the person wants to come back in or not. The door in your analogy, your paradigm is the door will be closed one day.
Well, the door is death. The door is death. The door is non-life, life, like absence of life.
Mm.
And so obviously that's an absence of consciousness, because you start off in the home, you start off with life, and you're walking away from life. You close the door. God doesn't close the door. You close the door. That's the way I see it. Is you're closing the door. We've gone way off of the.
I love this conversation, by the way. I hope you don't think I'm in any
No.
way. I
I
love it.
I'm happy for this
And
at any time.
I love it. I love it. And that's what I said. You and I think, we'd sit down and have a
Well,
nice lemon tea or hot drink and really enjoy these conversations. I'm loving it. We're going to come back to the topic.
yes.
And I can't see who it is, but someone said, if you accept rebellious children, who threaten your life and still allow them to stay, you haven't experienced rebellious children. Yeah, that might be true. Because I've created a loving environment, they're not rebelling.
Yeah.
I don't know who said that, but thank you for your comment. So we're going to have that break that I mentioned, and then we're going to come back and bring some conclusions to the conversation with
Yes.
you, perhaps really clearly defining where you disagree with Kerry.
Yeah.
And Kerry, it's like well past midnight where he is, so he couldn't be watching tonight, he said, but he's going to jump into the comments later.
Yes.
and may even do a counter rebuttal to the rebuttal interview down
A rejoinder. Maybe get us both on sometime.
Hey, I would love that.
Yes.
Would you be open to that?
I'd be open. Yeah, easy.
I love it. I love that openness that you have. I really appreciate it. I'm enjoying this conversation. Everyone, have a refreshment break. My very special guest today is Brendan Valiant. We will be back in 5 minutes. I'm going to top up with lemon water. I'm going to come on board your train there.
I have to deal with the consequences of drinking this much lemon water, so I'll be back in a moment.
It's your refreshment break too.
Yes.
Back.
You love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Well, here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, then all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again. Da 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 da. never be the same. You love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same. Will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Well, here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, and all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again.
Hey, and we're back. I've got orange and water, not lemon and water in this one.
Works.
That'll work the same, hopefully. We've got 3 orange trees in the backyard, so there's a freshly squeezed mixed with water. It's lovely. Welcome back, everybody. And my very special guest today is Brendan Paul Valiant, non-denominational pastor, Adventist in exile, which we chatted about a little at the start.
Yes.
And great, everyone stayed with us during the little refreshment break there. Appreciate that. We're talking about the lunar Sabbath and is it madness? And we've gone off track a couple of times there, but that's all right. That's what conversations are for. I'm very much enjoying our conversation. As you've looked down some of the the comments and questions. Has there been anything there that you wanted to address before we kind of start to draw some conclusions?
No, look, there's some great discussion going on the covenants. That could probably be another topic entirely. I'd be happy to talk. Like I said, I can talk about pretty much anything. The reason I know about the lunar Sabbaths is I went through that phase of learning I just looked into every nook and cranny of Christendom. So I've been through Hebrew roots movement. I've been through all of that. I love the covenant. Going through the covenants. That's my main bread and butter, is the covenant of Christ. So yeah, like just amazing. There's probably some things I disagree with them, but those would be extraneous to where I want to kind of land this when it comes to Kerry and give him enough. If he's going to do a rejoinder.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll ask him, because this is kind of number 3 in our series within a series.
Yes.
Series within a season.
Yeah.
2 seasons.
So I've got asynchronous anomalies that I can go through. Things that don't line up with a lunar Sabbath hypothesis.
Go for it. You've got the floor.
Okay, so the first one is creation week. So God is, if God is keeping the first, and now I know Kerry says that the first 7th day is not a Sabbath because the word Sabbath is not explicitly there. I've read his Lying for God book. However, the verb that is used for God rested is the verbal form of the noun Sabbath. He Shabbated, essentially, So the first day he Shabbats, and so that first week is impossible to be according to the moon because the moon is created midweek. So you've got day 1, no moon. Day 2, no moon. Day 3, no moon. Day 4, the moon is there, but with no observer on Earth to look at the moon and count. And so the first day, calendar day, for Adam and Eve is the day that they're created on, or the very next day that the very next full day. So for them, their first full day was Sabbath. So the Sabbath was according to God's cycle in that first week anyway. So that's the first thing that doesn't quite line up with a Sabbath being according to the moon. The moon is in midweek. The next one that we have, I'm just going to run through them. If you want to talk about any of them in detail, some of them are quite detailed. Let me just
you go through them, and then Steve Scott has messaged me. He's driving up from Victoria to Sydney and listening as he drives, and he must have pulled over and asked a couple of questions, so we'll bring them in at the end.
Okay, perfect. So I can go into some more. So the next one is the 40 years of manna. Now God is very simple in how he explains this. There's going to be 6 days when bread's going to fall. So bread's going to be found on the ground. Bread's going to be found on the ground for 6 mornings. And on the 6th morning, there's going to be double the amount. On the 7th, there's not going to be any. And anything that you try to carry over, if you try to carry over today's bread till tomorrow, it'll decay, unless it's the Friday's bread or the day before Sabbath, and then it'll actually last longer. So this was a way of God cementing for 40 years they say that a habit can be formed after 40 days. Well, imagine 40 years. This is a ingrained practice. That's as simple as the instructions are. There's nothing mentioning, there might be a day out, an odd day out. Oh, there's that new moon day that's not really a Sabbath. That's going to be 8 days. There's going to be 8 days of falling bread that time. And there's only going to be 1 day after if there's a 30th day of the month, there'll be bread on that day. There's nothing of that sort. And so you've got an argument from silence from Kerry when I think you did bring up Pentecost. That's another one that's coming in a moment. He calls them non-days. Well, the Bible doesn't speak about these non-days. So you've got to create and insert. That's premise forcing. That's eisegesis. That's inserting into the text. Oh, yeah, those days should also be considered whatever. You're the special pleading, and that's not in the text. And then the next one is Pentecost, which is a count of 50, and it's doing it by 50 weeks. Okay, so sorry, not 50 weeks, 7 weeks. If you look at in Leviticus, it says 70 Shabbats, 70 Shabbats, but in Deuteronomy, the parallel text says 7 weeks, not 70, 7 weeks. and it uses a different term. You shall count 7 weeks, Deuteronomy 16:9. And so if you've got these weeks which are kind of like a 1-day week or a 8-day week, you can't get 50. You just can't count 50 days within the lunar Sabbath, where some weeks can be 8 days long if you're not counting the new moon as a day. It's just it doesn't fit. None of it fits. You can't count to 50 that way. So it's another asynchronous anomaly. Then you can go all the way to Jesus' time. So if we fast forward to the New Testament, there's a few things that don't fit. The first of these is that there is a narrative, an unbroken narrative, a chain of events between John chapter 7 verse 37 and John chapter 9 verse 41. And let me just run through them. In John chapter 7 verse 37 to 39, you have the last day of Tabernacles, which is the 22nd of Tishri. It's the 22nd of the 7th month. So we know what day that is calendarically. Then the next event is that there's division among the Jews concerning Jesus, because he calls himself the light of the world. And so there's division of the Jews. The next event is, and that's in verse 40 to 44. The next event is verse 45 to 53, which is that the Sanhedrin meets concerning Jesus. What do we do about this guy? The next event is that Jesus goes to Mount of Olives in John chapter 8, verse 1. The next event in this narrative is John chapter 8, verse 2 to 11, and that's the woman caught in adultery. The next event is Jesus gives a message in the treasury of the temple, John chapter 8, verse 12 to 59. And then there's the 7th event is John chapter 9, verse 1 to 41. And that is Jesus heals a blind man on the Sabbath. So we know that at the beginning of this chain of events, it's the 22nd of Tishri, and several days later, and we can figure out the number of days through some deduction, that it's the Sabbath. Now, according to the lunar Sabbath idea, the Sabbath is always the first. Sorry, not the first, that's a new moon. It's always the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. So if we can find a Sabbath in the Bible that is not an 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, then we've disproven the theory. Now, there will be Sabbaths that will line up with that just by nature of the moving of the months. So those are not proving the theory, they can prove either way.
But you're saying not consistently.
It's not going to be consistent. You know, one in 7 months will have the Sabbath lining up with those dates just by virtue of probability. So the last day of Tabernacles, that's the 22nd of Tishri. It doesn't tell us what day of the week it is, but it is it's the first day in this sequence. It's the first event in this sequence. And then there's division concerning the Jews, among the Jews concerning Jesus. And then there's a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Now, we know that meeting of the Sanhedrin can't be on the 22nd of Tishri. It has to have been the next day, because the Jews did not convene the Sanhedrin on Sabbaths and on feast days, on holy convocation days during the feast. It would meet during the non-holy convocations, but the 22nd, according to Leviticus 23, is a holy convocation. So it has to have been after sunset at very least of the 22nd. So we're now in the 23rd. So we've moved to one day beyond. And then the language in John tells us that there is a sequence of events. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, and that is the same, that is on the 23rd as well. That has to be on the 23rd. And then the next morning, it's indicating that there's this encounter with the woman caught in adultery. That has to be the next day because it's daytime. The whole scenario is now daytime. So it has to be the next day or 24 hours, within 24 hours of that, just based on the grammar that we have there. Sorry, I just lost my place here. Scrolling back up. Okay, and then the next thing that happens is Jesus is in the temple. It's the same day as the woman caught in adultery. He then goes into the temple and has a big discourse there. And then he heals the blind man. Now we know that the day that the woman is caught in adultery is not a Sabbath. So this has to be after sunset. But as he's going out of the temple, it's nighttime, and he heals the blind man. It's now Sabbath. Why? Because the Jews did not do judgment on the Sabbath. as I said, the Sanhedrin doesn't meet. The Beth Din does not sit on the Sabbath. The Beth Din is the house of judgment. It is not allowed to, according to their laws. They would not have brought a woman accused of sin before Jesus on a Sabbath day. They wouldn't have done that. So this has to have happened. So it has to have been Friday when that happens. So we've got at the maximum, we've got 3 days after the 22nd that a Sabbath is occurring. At the minimum, 2 days. You could squeeze it into 2. There's no way that the 22nd, which is the day of the day of the feast, the last great day of Tabernacles. There's no way that day can be a Sabbath, because the Sabbath is within 2 or 3 days of this. You can't balloon it out, because the Greek is using immediacy in the and then this happened. It's not allowing time. It's on that same day, basically, is what the Greek is saying. So that's the next asynchronous anomaly. The next one that we go from there is the crucifixion week. Once again, the crucifixion week does not actually, the crucifixion week does line up with their theory, because it would have the Sabbath falling on the 15th. However, it uses a very unique term. And I did see someone mention this way back at the beginning. Could you address the high day? Because it says it says that Sabbath was a high day. Well, if every Sabbath is going to coincide with the 15th, meaning that there would be a conjunction of Sabbath and feast day, then there would be no need to give it a unique term. But John is unique in all of literature that we have extant, calling this a high day. And the only logical way of looking at it is it's a high day because you've got a convergence of a Sabbath with a feast day. They're both, so it becomes a fuller day. It becomes there's no other way that makes logical or rational sense there. So he's saying that Sabbath was a high day. It's a convergence day. And that can only happen, that's rare. It would only happen once every 7 years that the Sabbath would fall on, just again based on probability there. So and depending on whether some lunar Sabbatarians have a Wednesday Passover, sometimes you can plug other ideas into this as well. The next one is in Paul's trip to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 20. So Paul is going on this trip back to Jerusalem via some of the communities of faith that he has planted along the way. And we are given an unbroken chain of days between Passover and the first day of the week, where that guy falls preaching into the night, and he's not a very good preacher because the guy falls out the window, falls asleep and falls out the window, and he has to be raised to life. You know that story, right? And that's the first day of the week, and that's often used as, well, they met on the first day. Well, yes, they met every day. They were going day to day and breaking bread. But we know that's a first day of the week. That's what we would call a Sunday, or a day after Sabbath. And we know that Paul was in Philippi for Passover at the beginning of this chain of events. So we've got 4 things that happen. Paul spends Passover and unleavened bread in Philippi, and then he travels for 5 days to Troas, and then he abides in Troas for 7 days, and his last day in Troas was the first day of the week. So you can count backwards and figure this out. It's not rocket science. And you would, if you were figuring this out, he's in Philippi for the 8 days of the feast, because Passover plus unleavened bread is 8 days. Passover is the 14th, and unleavened bread is from the 15th to the 21st. So he would have departed on the 22nd, and he would have arrived. So 22nd, you've got 5 days of travel. So 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th would be traveling. And then he's got 7 days in Troas. And so that's 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th of Nisan. And then you've got Iyar, which is the second month. Day 5 would be ER1. Day 2 would be ER2. Sorry, day 6 would be ER2. Day 7, the first day of the week, is ER3. And that means that the Sabbath was ER2. So just by calculating the chronology of this series of events, you can't get a lunar Sabbath cycle. It doesn't fit with their hypothesis. So that's another asynchronous anomaly. The final one is not explicit in the Bible. It's something that we know from extra biblical sources, and it is the controversy between the Sadducees and the Pharisees over the wave sheaf. So the wave sheaf was to be waved before the Lord on the morrow after the Sabbath, according to Leviticus 23. So on the morrow after the Sabbath, you wave the first of the harvest before the Lord. Now, the word Sabbath is there's the same word for seventh-day Sabbath. So the Sadducees were saying, you do this on the day after on the first Sunday, what we would call Sunday, on the first Sunday within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it could be any date versus day. It could be any date within that. Whereas the Pharisees said, no, the morrow after the Sabbath is the morrow after the 15th, being a holy convocation, which is a type of Sabbath. So it's the morrow after so it's always the 16th. The Pharisees would say that it's the 16th. Why is this important? Well, how can this controversy erupt if the Sabbath, according to the timing of Jesus, is always on the 15th? There would be no grounds for this controversy to erupt, because the 16th would always be the Sunday. And the Essenes had an even different view. They were saying it's the morrow after the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they put it off a whole week after the Sadducees. So you had three different sects that only could have this controversy if the Sabbath was movable throughout the calendar. And so there's no grounds for you to have this idea of Sabbath being always fixed to the 15th, 22nd, and 29th. Otherwise, this controversy is not even possible. And this controversy has an end date because the Sadducees ceased to exist after the destruction of the temple. There is no Sadducean continuation post AD 70. The Pharisees basically dominated Judaism from there on. So those are the things that don't match up, and those you can get from the Bible or from basic history.
Yeah, so these are the things that are beyond my research because I'm so new at it, but I'm glad you've stated them clearly, because that gives people like Kerry, Steve, others that might disagree with you, they've got now some food to mull over, and will make a fascinating exchange. Can I bring in Steve, as I mentioned, Steve Scott, who was the first person I interviewed on the Lunar Sabbath. He's driving from Victoria to Sydney, and he's been listening, and he pulled over to send a question. I've cut and pasted it here, and I'll bring it up on the screen.
Yeah, please do.
And see what you think. So he's saying, if a person only has the word, in brackets logos, Greek equals logical, or Bible, to determine the Sabbaths, will that person conclude Saturday is Sabbath? That is, without reference to history and other cultures.
Okay.
I've obviously left out a word there. Computer statistics and so forth.
Okay. So this is one of the things that I didn't see Kerry bring out, but I'm glad that you're bringing this out. The Lunar Sabbatarians that I have seen, I think that you haven't left it out. It just looks like it's only limited to a certain amount of text.
It has, yeah.
Yes.
Usually I can read it off screen, but it's
no, that's okay.
It's hiding it there. But yeah, the last two words are computer statistics and so forth.
So a lot of Lunar Sabbatarians in their literature have these gotcha questions, like, well, where's Saturday in the Bible? And so you can't find Saturday in the Bible, therefore throw out the whole lot. Well, it's not quite as clear cut as that, because to this question assumes having no other knowledge and data. So let's say you were born and able to be raised without any education on an island that only had a Bible, and you also happen to be able to read that Bible. Would you conclude that Saturday is the Sabbath? That's the hypothetical. So it's an absurd hypothetical. And so I'm just pointing out that it's an absurd hypothetical, because we do know all of these other things. We do have history. We do have cultures. But I don't think that if we have the Bible, that we only have the Bible. I believe the Bible is the word of God, and that the word that Jesus said, the words that I speak, they are spirit and they are life. If we have the Bible, we have the Holy Spirit. If you have the Bible and the Holy Spirit, I mean, have you heard of Menelik? I think his name is the Eskimo prophet. There was a prophet that spoke about Jesus and the Sabbath to the Eskimos. You need to look at the documentary series by Arabito, Pat Arabito put out. It was actually the concept was drafted before Jim Arabito died, but he goes through documenting Sabbath throughout history and throughout culture. And God raised a prophet to the Eskimos that taught them about Sabbath. I believe that God can teach us through the still small voice, through revelation, through a loud voice if needed. If you were on that island and God wanted you to know which day was the Sabbath, he would tell you. But even if you got it wrong and you're doing it conscientiously to the best of your knowledge, the Bible tells us that in times of ignorance, God winks at us. God winks at that ignorance. It's only once we have the knowledge that he calls all men to repent. So it's a question that's absurd to me because it assumes a situation that is not even feasible. You're talking about Tarzan, basically. The story of Tarzan, according to Edgar Rice Burroughs, he's raised in a jungle by apes and happens to figure out how to read by himself. It's amazing the way that no movie could ever do it justice. Edgar Rice Burroughs does a great job of describing the psychology of that learning experience for Tarzan. But let's say you were Tarzan and all you had was you figured out how to read and you had a Bible and you had no other stuff. Fine, okay, you still got the Holy Spirit. You've still got the Holy Spirit, and if the Holy Spirit doesn't convict you of which day, then obviously God is going to wink at that. But in the reality, in the real world, coming back to the real world, we have history, we have culture, we have all of that, and we can determine to accuracy that the seventh-day Sabbath of the Bible aligns with what we call Saturday. Oh, actually, I would let me correct. Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. What we call that is what the biblical Sabbath is. There's not another way around it. Has he got any other questions?
No, his signal dropped out, and he said he'll have to listen back in later. So otherwise, he would have commented on that.
No, that's fine.
I'd love to work out how the Eskimos would keep Sabbath in their part of the world, considering the sun hardly dips below the horizon for most of the year.
Or sometimes it doesn't even rise very much.
Yeah.
I've been up in Finland beyond the Arctic Circle, and I have seen the sun do this. I've seen the sun just kind of dip the horizon, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
And how would you keep the Sabbath if you lived there? And what was Ellen White's advice for those that lived in those realms?
Oh, look, I'm not an Ellen Whiteist. I'm just going to go based on the principles that I've built as looking at these calendars. Is that observation? As I said to you, observation is secondary to the determination by the lunar. By the celestial bodies. By God's time.
So if you were there in that part of the world where the sun is going like that, you'd probably log in each day on your computer and find out what Israel was doing, and then extrapolate 7
even without a computer
24-hour periods. Or
even without a computer, they don't just have an extremely long day, and they've never had just extremely long days that just go on for months. They've always had ways of timekeeping, whether it's hourglasses or whatever. People have always been able to keep time without the sun and the moon, because sometimes we don't have the sun and the moon, like with storms and whatever. Sometimes
I wonder why God thinks it's so important.
What do you mean?
That we keep track of these things.
Look, to give you...
Is it something that really just started since civilization of 10, 11,000 years ago, when humans began domesticating animals and farming and gathering they left the hunter-gatherer kind of realm and started the existence in towns and communities, and therefore they had to become a little bit more focused on time and stuff. Prior to that, it was pretty much like, oh, okay, here we go. Here's the sun. Here's the
as a
season.
as a believer in Genesis's history, I don't accept the premise that long ages and evolution anyway. But that aside, I think that look, we need time to determine things. I'll see you tomorrow. That like even just as simply as that. Even within a localized agrarian society, you'd still have some level of keeping time. The Bible sets most of our time by the celestial bodies.
Yeah.
The Sabbath is one thing that is set, that like the month, the year, they revolve around the bodies that we see. The Sabbath is something that revolves around God.
Yeah, I'm just struggling grasping. I mean, the funny thing for me, leaving when I left Adventism, and as we were chatting earlier, you were left kind of by
I
force.
was
Would that be
ousted.
the
Yes.
word? You were ousted, and I chose to go.
Yeah.
I I've had the pleasure in many ways of totally deconstructing and then just rebuilding again based on using my mind and exploration of how my mind discovers the world. And so I'm struggling with. I fully get the use of time and time frame and using the sun and days and calendars so we can plan when we're going to the dentist and this kind of thing. I just can't re-grasp the notion of it being a salvation issue. I'm struggling with that, but that might be a whole other interview.
Yeah, it's probably another interview, and I think we need to start at some basics on what salvation is and what that whole plan is. Like I think like there are certain things that you've asked when it comes to that I'm like I'm not even on the platform that you're on. So for me to answer, I would have to like have that like build a bridge
Yeah,
between our
exactly. Yeah,
platform.
that's why I think it's for another time. And I'd
Yeah.
love to discuss that Ty Gibson reference where you were sort of saying you're 99.9% an atheist, and he uses that story,
Yeah.
which I'm pretty sure is an urban myth story that he's been able to extrapolate a parable from, because there's no atheist I know that would answer as weakly as his
Yeah, no, I'm not
airplane
basing it
passenger
on that.
atheist.
I mean,
But
I was mentored by David, so I did hear that from David, and I agree with it. I
well,
don't know about the story. I don't know about the story or the urban myth. All I just say is to people is, your gods that you reject are usually the same as the God I would reject.
Yeah, and Ty Gibson's got a video where he talks about being on a plane and he's sitting next to an atheist, and he goes, I'm an atheist too, and I'm like, come on, an atheist, but he eventually then says, because there's one God, I don't believe in any of the gods either except for this one, and I'm like, an atheist would go, dude, I am not convinced that there is any conclusive evidence to confirm the belief in any God.
Yeah.
So I just think his story was a bit disingenuous, but like you said accurately, if you're coming from a different platform and mindset, and I'm coming from a different platform and mindset, you have to build bridges before you can have those conversations.
Exactly. Even our very language will be
We're different,
with different connotations.
Yeah.
We often use similar words but mean completely different things based on our background and our worldview and things like that. So I actually think that we'd probably not be too far off, but it would be about building that bridge, and that's
what's our jargon? And I think if you are speaking to the atheist community, you have to be really aware that they are simply saying, I'm not convinced that there is any conclusive evidence to validate a belief in any God.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call that an atheist. I call that an agnostic.
Well, what does that guy say? I've got a mental blank. Long around the Darwin era, he says that agnostics invented the word agnostic to come across as a nice version of being an atheist, and there's such a nuanced there's just such a nuanced difference between the two. Essentially,
an atheist, I can't think that there is such thing as a pure atheist. I just can't.
No, even Richard Dawkins says, yeah, of course, you can't prove that there is or there isn't.
Yeah.
But what the word they use is plausibility. It's
Yes.
it's not plausible to suggest there are unicorns or fairies down the end of your garden, or a god, or Thor, or Odin. The
Mm.
agnostic says, look, I'm still open to exploring knowledge.
Yeah.
And the atheist says, I'm kind of not really even open to exploring that anymore, because, do I spend time exploring if there's a unicorn or not? And so agnostic, atheist essentially are saying the same thing. And agnostic may be a bit more interested in exploring the data. An
Yeah.
atheist is happy to be confronted with it, is happy to say, hey, yeah, sure, there might be a God, I don't know. But
Mm.
he's saying there's no conclusive evidence to suggest that there is any God.
Yeah.
So that's
And
why
that
I
comes
say,
back to what we kind of talked about earlier, the taste and see. I'm an experiential theist. I've experienced that there is a God. So, I mean,
yeah,
I'm
but you
not
can't,
open.
apart from your own anecdotal evidence, you can't conclusively demonstrate that or replicate that for someone else to experience as well.
No, I can't, and I don't need to. But I know
Yeah.
that God can. I know that God can, and
And,
so that's all I say is, there
and,
is. I've seen healings. I've seen miracles. I've seen, and one of the best things is getting thrust out of Adventism is seeing that there are legitimate forms and modes of worship and practicing Christianity outside of Adventism, and in the scary places, the scary.
yeah.
And so I've seen these things. I can't deny what I've seen.
And again, they're your experiences, but they can't be replicated in a way that would satisfy conclusively for an empirical data to confirm it and prove it.
Look, I
No,
believe
no
there is.
one can. No
I
one
know.
can prove.
Well, empirically, the question of origins, and maybe that could be another topic. I mean, I find empirical data is far greater on the idea of an intelligence than on the idea of chance. So
Yeah, but see, there's people that say that.
even if I just say I'm going to leave aside the fact that this God that I've experienced and I'm in relationship with, let's leave that aside. If I was just coming from a blanket, looking at the world and making sense of it, the empirical data is far and above
But
on one side.
But there's psychic readers, mediums, new agers, people who believe in fairies. Literally, there's people that believe in fairies. They all would say exact same thing. There's empirical data to prove right, and I've seen them. I experienced it. I see them.
Well, you mean experiential data?
Well, whatever. There's
They
no
would have experiential.
empirical data, but there's experiential data. And what I'm saying is that everyone can claim experiential data. And I guess where I was going, and this is a conversation for another time. We'll wrap it up. But my point was that when I listened to Ty Gibson's story of being on the plane talking to someone, that to me was an example of him not understanding an atheist's claim.
Ty Gibson,
because atheists aren't making a claim.
Yeah, I respect Ty Gibson. I think he's got some excellent insights.
Oh, and I'm not criticizing him. It's just like you and I have a different. We're not criticizing each other. I'm not criticizing him.
Be a
I'm
little
just
bit.
saying,
we can all be a little bit insular in like thinking that our outside view of another person's worldview is how that worldview is, but it's not.
Yeah, I loved your analogy of the two platforms, or in the analogy of islands. We've got your island, my island. You have to build a bridge in some way and really get inside someone else's head. And a lot of people just sit on their island and see the other island and think, oh, well, if I put my thoughts over there, they'd understand.
And that's why these long forms are really good, because we can we can build that bridge and
and I'm definitely not putting Ty Gibson down, but I'm suggesting he's on a platform where he's trying to use an example that people on the other island are going to go, dude, that is just ridiculous.
It happens all the time.
It happens to me. I'll watch this back and I go, man, I was ignorant. I don't really have the answers or make claims. Boy, I've enjoyed this conversation, Brendan. We crossed paths years ago when I had my music shop right here in Cooranbong, which I had for 21 years. Can you believe that?
Wow.
And I've kind of watched some of your Facebook stuff, some of your recent experiences over the last year or two. And so I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I think, again, proving that people can have diverse, divergent views, robust discussions, but it's still important and civil, and you can go away liking people. I'm the same with Kerry and Steve. I really enjoy them, you know.
I'm Facebook friends with Kerry. I don't dislike him, even though I disagree. I don't dislike people based on what they think. I can my revulsion to someone generally stems from the way they treat other people. If it's going to be anything, over differences, over intolerance. I'm intolerant of intolerance, I guess that's what you.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
Yes.
I'm intolerant of intolerance, and I don't like people saying I'm not allowed to ask questions.
What does Austin Powers say? He says, "There's two things I can't stand in this world: people who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Dutch." And the Dutch.
You know, something I've discovered since leaving the church
Yeah.
is Adventists don't really get satire. They'll watch a show like that and laugh, but they're laughing at the slapstick nature of it.
Yeah.
I'm not criticizing, and it's just something I've noticed that I'll
Probably why I've
often
never fit in Adventism, because my sense of humor has been very satirical, coming from the world.
well, I'll make some jokes here and over at Voice, and often people will say, "Oh, no, they were saying this," and I go, "Yeah, I know they were saying that. I was being satirical." And anyway, yeah.
So Voice is an online fellowship, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's Voice Life Fellowship,
Mm.
which is a small group that only focuses on the four Gospels.
Yeah.
Not to say that that's all you're allowed to focus on, but it's the starting point. It's
Yes.
a reference point. It's a springboard. If you can't preach
Beautiful.
the gospel from the four Gospels, something's wrong.
Exactly.
And even Jesus didn't know about Paul, and Paul didn't ever meet Jesus. So Jesus successfully preached his gospel message without ever knowing about Paul's 7 churches or however many there were. So I just think it's a good springboard. But there's also SDA People's Voice, which is a community as big as SDA Q&A, but it's where people get to comment all the time. SDA Q&A is where I do the interviews, and people don't really comment into the group. They can comment on the interviews.
Yeah. This
So
is
they're
where
the
your Seth
3.
Rogen. This is where your long form is.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Joe Rogan. Yeah.
Joe Rogan. Yeah, Joe Rogan. Yeah.
And we're
So
now,
you meet every week online with the
so it's going to be like that one day.
Okay.
We have tried that, and I'd love to get you to do a gospel message for us one day too.
Yeah.
We
Happy to.
meet the third Sabbath of the third Saturday of the month on the lunar.
I was actually tongue in cheek, just to give. I was waiting for you to say that, because I was like, I was going to say Happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath, yeah. On the lunar Sabbath, of course, the third lunar, at my venue that I've got in Toronto, just right near the Lake Macquarie. Beautiful, beautiful area.
Fantastic.
Cafes within stone's throw. It's just amazing.
Is it a morning or an afternoon?
Afternoon, 2:00, third Saturday of the month. Thanks for letting me give a plug for it.
Yeah.
But it's a very small group.
Yeah.
And so what we're doing is building the online group. So the online group is where I get to go. We're only talking positive stuff. There's no political stuff. There's no stuff like what we're talking today.
Yeah.
SDA People's Voice is where people just get to talk about whatever they want within reason, I guess. And here is where I get to do my long play interviews. But we are now doing Wednesday afternoon reaction videos that are trying to be shorter.
Yes.
I said 20 to 30 minutes, and one of them was 40 minutes, and the other one was an hour and a half.
Yeah.
But I'll get better at that. And I'm also, the third thing I'm doing is re-releasing the season 2 series, which was all the Glacier View 86.
Yeah.
And I got an email from someone today, and I won't quote who they are or what they were, but they were essentially saying that, oh, you guys just seem so interested and can't let go of this stuff. And I just don't get that. Like, if people want to talk about something, great. You don't have to talk about it. But they didn't like me, criticizing the record yesterday.
Look, I mean, I come from a view that the investigative judgment, or the motif of the investigative judgment, is all through the Bible, not just in one place. And if you look at Daniel 11, even non-Adventist scholars have concluded that the prayer, not Daniel 11, Daniel 9, Daniel's prayer in Daniel chapter 9 is a Day of Atonement prayer. There's many links to Leviticus 16, for example. And I think Adventists are not very good at corporately understanding our guilt on things, on the way we've treated people.
Mm.
It's hard to let go of something that is traumatic, even if you move through it and you get to the point where you don't let it define you. It will still be a painful thing in our past. And Adventists, we would lose nothing to apologize for the wrongs that we have done. We'd lose nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
And it grieves me. I wasn't born when Glacier View happened, but it grieves me, and I repent of the way that the church has treated people.
Yeah. I'm only laughing because I keep forgetting that I'm much older than you. Yeah.
Although, seriously, you look as young as you did when you were doing barn nights at Avondale.
It's the lighting. And yeah. And by the way, when I was mentioning the record just then, I'm not criticizing the record, and I'm not expecting them to go into a deep retrospective of it.
No.
There were just 2 or 3 very inaccurate stances they repeated that were mistakes in 1980 when the first article was written. They're basically doing a vintage look back or retrospective. And they claim the consensus statement confirmed Des was not in alignment with the church, and therefore he was defrocked.
Yeah.
But in my interview with Bill Johnson, he confirms very conclusively that there was a consensus statement that was voted on, that the majority agreed with, including Des.
Yes.
And that's just the polar opposite. So if you're going to be an honest journalist and you're writing a retrospective, you need to say, we want to note that this was inaccurate.
Yeah.
Demonstrably, Bill Johnson was one of 3, probably the main of the 3, that wrote the consensus statement, was there, heard Des say that. He agrees.
Yeah.
So that's
I've been a part of something very similar to that. I spent several years in fringe ministries within Adventism, and there was one ministry that split over the topic of are we born sinners, of all things. And
yes, that's a big one.
I was there at the when it split in half.
Well, that is actually kind of almost ground zero of the Adventist split.
Yeah.
The nature of Christ. Are we born sinners? Are we born with the propensity to sin? Christ didn't sin, therefore we can not sin. What is sinlessness? It's a very core issue. So you tell us more about that.
Well, I mean, the what I saw was I got up there as trying to be a peacemaker and saying, here's how I understand sin and babies and how it affects that. And so I explained it. And then I said to the people who were on one side, I said, do you agree with what I've said? And they said, yes. And then I turned to the people who were getting ousted from this ministry. Do you agree with what I said? And they said, yes. And I said, there's no controversy here. You are seeing, you're on different platforms speaking different jargon, different lingo, and you are speaking past each other. And I think that's where a lot of these divisions start. As I read the Glacier View manuscript, I'm like, okay, look, I could see some of this as being legitimate questions, and I'm not, au fait on all of the politics that happen, but I'm like, this is valid to be discussed.
100%.
One of my favorite authors did, I think, the fairest treatment of the soteriology of Ford, which was Leroy Moore's book, Theology in Crisis, or the Theology Crisis. He was fair. And I think that is, if we were just more fair to one another, to sit down and seek to understand, seek to connect and work out each other's dialects, our individual dialects. A lot of these things would be, it's probably one of the, just because of how important Des Ford was to Australia and Australian Adventism, it's a deep regret I never got to meet the guy, and I'll look forward to the resurrection morning and look for him, unlike some who might not.
I'll be shocked. He's here.
Well, I mean, I might not be there, like but for the grace of God. And at the end of the day, I mean, up here, that I think his ministry is based in this area in the Gold Coast.
Yeah.
Good News Unlimited is based here. I hear them on the same radio station I do podcasts on sometimes. They have advertisements, so they're wanting to spread the gospel, and I couldn't be more happy for more people to do it. What did Jesus say? Leave them alone. He was not against me, is for me.
Yeah, I was lamenting in my my reaction video with Gillian Ford and Mevin Whitaker yesterday, lamenting that from after Glacier View throughout the 80s, particularly the first 6 or 7 years into the 80s, over 200 ministers here, over 200 ministers in the States, thousands of families affected because of just that. Thousands left, nothing to do with those firings.
Yes.
All around the world. What a loss to Adventism. But what my theory is, and I don't know if you know much about the consensus statement, when the leaders saw, wow, hang on, he's agreeing with it, the whole the majority are agreeing with it, he's going to stay. So they wheeled out this 10-point statement in the afternoon, didn't vote on it, pinned him down. Can you agree with these 10 points? He says, in all conscience, I can't, right? The wheels are in motion for you to be gone. So the leaders, Neil Wilson, Ted Wilson's dad, they're going in the background, we have done the maths. If we keep Ford, those who want the authority of Ellen White uplifted on a pedestal are going to leave the church. We're going to lose the numbers. We have to get rid of Ford. Whereas I just think, imagine if it had been inclusive to have Des Ford, to have George Burnside, to have Andreessen, to have that community. What a powerful denomination it could have been. But they come to people like you, they come to people like Des, and they go, you're not towing the party line, snip, snip.
Yeah.
In the early 80s, back when faxing, before you were born, was the big deal, a fax went round to the ministers and I might be wrong. I've seen the fax, so I'm not making it up. I just can't remember the details, whether it was the Sydney conference or if it was all of Australia and New Zealand. But the fax said, don't invite. It was sent to ministers, and a minister showed me the fax, FAX, by the way. And it said, don't invite George Burnside or Des Ford into your churches to speak. Because George Burnside represented the concerned brethren, the really conservative guys. Des presented the liberal progressive new theology. And the administrators see that as trouble for the money, for the big members, for those that love Ellen White as the Elvis of the church. And so they just cut them both off. So they see someone like you coming along and saying, hey, I want to ask these questions about these interesting current events. Bye-bye, Brendan. Bye-bye, Des. Bye-bye, George.
Yeah. Well, they cut off the heads, but those people developed disciples that went and did the same trouble from a polarizing view. I mean, you had Austin Cook, you had, like that. The fraction was there
in town here.
Sorry?
All the concerned brethren eventually either came from here or ended up here when they retired in Kurrambong.
Yeah. You can probably go and do a who's who through the cemetery there.
Well, when in the 80s and 90s, whenever I was living in Kurrambong, I'd be rubbing shoulders with them regularly at the elephant shop. Like the elephant shop was owned by, I've just got a mental blank. One of them.
I know. I know who.
His son took over, and then his son sold eventually to the caliphs.
Yeah.
But I know him super well.
Yeah.
I grew up with those guys. We had derogatory terms, CBs.
and those things don't help. Those things never help.
No, I'm embarrassed about that, but I was young and stupid.
Like the temptation could be. I mean, as a satirist, I can come up with names like that very easily. I mean, Lunar Sabbath makes it very easy for the topic we're talking about. Lunatic.
Lunatic. I know.
I mean, it's not helpful. I mean, we're all.
See that there. I love satire and irony because they are nuanced ways of addressing situations. When people go, "Oh, you're a CB" or "You're a lunatic," they're ad hominem attacks on the person.
Exactly.
So you don't get to talk about the topic.
And so I think that it's just like let's treat each other as people that Jesus died for, if we look at each other through the lens of that, look, we might not agree on most things until we get to heaven and God bashes our heads together and says, "You were all wrong." On something, and that's going to be the case.
Or we wake up with all the fairies and go, "Oh, hang on, there's little elves over there, and oh, there's some unicorns."
I'll
Who
be
knows?
looking for Legolas. I'll be looking for Legolas.
Hey, I've loved this conversation. You're definitely invited back, and I'll chat to Kerry, who I also enjoy chatting with, and we'll see if we can have a great civil conversation.
It might be worth going through the comments and
There-
finding any questions to bring
There's
up a
so
list of.
many here. Yeah,
I know it got
I'll-
away from us.
I'll bring up this one that Moto Sapien said, but Jesus met Paul on the Emmaus Road. Here's how my mind works. and I can't even, I hesitate to even say it. And I don't know if I believe it or not, but my first thought is, well, okay, Paul used to be Saul. He used to kill Christians. He claims to have met supernatural Jesus. All his writings very rarely refer to actual Jesus. He never met actual Jesus. And when he did talk to the apostles, as you can see in the Bible itself, there in the New Testament, they rejected him as an apostle. So I go, but you can't ask why. That's like, you're anti-Paul. No, I'm just asking a question.
Well, where my mind goes is actually it was Damascus, not Emmaus. You've mixed up your Bible stories there, but I get what you're saying. You know, Damascus, road to Damascus. I would probably push back on. I don't think that they rejected his apostleship. He was accepted as an equal in the Acts 15 council. He was. I think that they questioned it to begin with because this guy's been killing us.
And that's why me asking why leads to a conversation where I get to learn. Yeah. And Moto Sapiens has just written, he knew. I know you knew that, Moto Sapiens.
I know you knew that.
Moto Sapiens are regular, and I love having your comment, mate. That's fantastic. So appreciate it.
I love the name, Moto Sapien. That's cool.
Yes, I know. They're coming so fast and thick, I can't even keep up.
Yeah.
Look, what we'll do is invite you're in SDAQ&A. I'd love you to go to the Facebook group. Those that are watching on YouTube, join our Facebook group. It's in the description below. Click it, answer a couple of questions, come into the community for conversation, and we'll keep it going there. Kerry's just joined.
Hi, Kerry.
Hey, Kerry, and he's just written, great program, heading to bed as it is about 1 a.m. here in the USA. We'll prepare answers to objections. Thanks. Oh, so maybe Kerry was watching the whole time. Yeah.
Look, glad that you were there. Look, before you close, is it okay or inappropriate for me as a pastor to say, can we just pray?
Hey, no problems at all.
Thank you.
It's funny, of the over 200 plus interviews I've done, I think only 2 people have requested to do that. I've got no problem with it at all.
No worries.
Fire away.
Father, I just thank you so much for the time that we've been able to spend connecting with each other. And when we connect with each other, we connect with a part of you that is expressed in each other. And I just pray for Peter's ministry. I pray for the work that is going on in just these asking of questions. I pray for all of those who've been watching, as well as we've been able to model a great discussion here, and whatever we can learn from each other and from the audience, I just pray that we'll be able to do that. I pray for Kerry and Scott, who have also studied this topic. I'd love to be able to talk with them. I pray also for your church, your wider church, your body. We've talked a little bit about that as well today. And Father, we're in need of deeper connection to Jesus, the head. We're in need of correction in the way that we've treated each other. We've treated people who ask questions. Father, I want to repent for that, where I might foster that in any part of my life. And I just pray that you'll bring your church to a character that looks more like Jesus and less like the world. The objectionable parts of the world. We just pray for you to live out your life in us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Brendan. And thank you very much for being on the program. Look forward to having you back. Quick reminder, there is a special, those watching Voice Life Fellowship is going live with Dave Edgren. I think it's our first experiment at doing this from his own home direct into the group this Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, I think. Look up Voice Life Fellowship as a Facebook group and join, and you can get an idea. It's just a small group, 300 members, but we're trying to build a positive group of people that want to look for the teachings of Jesus found in the four Gospels. So any closing words there, Brendan?
Look, can I give a shameless plug to
Yes.
our ministry? Yeah, if you want to check out our Saturday morning service, we always live stream it from my own Facebook page. Happy to, just Brendan Paul Valiant on Facebook. You can check out our church at border.church. And yeah, if you're ever in the Tweed Coolangatta area, you'd be welcome on a Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. While it's not daylight savings, after daylight savings, it's 9:30 Queensland, 10:30 New South Wales. We straddle the 10 o'clock. And we're right opposite Twin Towns across the roundabout in the Country Women's Association Hall. If you look for the pink building, we're next to that.
That's great. And like you say, they can find that on your Facebook group, Brendan Paul
Facebook
Valiant.
group, yep.
And
Facebook page, just my
Facebook
personal
page. Your personal page, yeah. And do you have a website?
Border.church. Border.church.
Border.church. And
or
the
if you
church
go
is
to
instead of a
border.church,
.com.
Yeah. So if you go to borderchurch.com, it'll take you to border.church
as well. Okay, great. I've watched your program sometimes online. I don't know if you've seen me coming in there.
I'm usually on the stage, and
yeah,
so I can't see. So
you see me in there doing some likes.
And just so you know, I'm not left-handed when I play the guitar.
Right.
It's mirrored. It's mirrored.
So
So
you have to switch that in your phone settings.
I tried. I can't. For some reason, it won't switch it because I use the front part of my phone.
Yeah.
So I'm using the front of my phone, and so
you can see if you're in the frame or not. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just look like I'm playing left-handed.
Playing left-handed. That's funny because I am left-handed, but I play guitar right-handed. That was back in the day where they would pray the left-handedness away. But it turns out that even though I became right-handed, I'm still left-handed after all.
Yeah.
Well, great to see you. Great conversation. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back next week. I might have a surprise on Wednesday and I won't say the name, but I've got someone who's going to be doing another conversation about the Record article, who wrote a book about Des Ford. May or may not happen. But I'm looking forward to that, everyone. See you all later.
Blessings, everyone. Bye.